In the merciless summer of 1873, a young woman lies broken and bleeding on a California trail, framed for murder, beaten nearly to death, and abandoned to die under the scorching sun. But when a solitary rancher finds her clinging to life, he makes a choice that will unravel a conspiracy of greed, violence, and lies reaching all the way to Sacramento's most powerful men. This is a story of survival against impossible odds, of courage when hope seems lost, and of two people who risk everything to expose the truth. If you're ready for a tale of justice, redemption, and a love forged in the fire of danger, stay with me until the very end. And please, hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The desert heat shimmered above the trail like liquid glass, distorting the horizon until earth and sky blurred into one white-hot blur. Thomas Brennan wiped the sweat from his eyes with the back of his hand and urged his horse forward, squinting against the glare that made every rock and scrub brush dance in waves. He'd been riding since dawn, eager to reach his ranch before the afternoon sun turned the valley into an oven, and the mare beneath him sensed his impatience. Her ears flicked forward, her pace steady despite the heat pressing down like a weight. He wasn't a man given to hurrying. 15 years of ranching had taught him that the land moved at its own speed, indifferent to human schedules. But today, the stillness felt wrong, too quiet. Even the birds had gone silent, and the wind that usually whispered through the sage had died to nothing. Then he saw it. A dark shape in the middle of the trail, crumpled against the pale dirt like a discarded coat. Thomas reined in sharply, the mare snorting and sidestepping as his hand moved instinctively to the rifle slung across his saddle. Bandits sometimes use decoys, a trick to draw travelers close before springing in ambush. He scanned the rocks and gullies flanking the road, looking for movement, for the glint of metal, for anything that didn't belong. Nothing. Just the shape in the dust, motionless under the sun. Thomas dismounted slowly, boots crunching on the hard pan as he approached with the rifle loose in his grip. The closer he got, the more the shape resolved into something that made his stomach drop. A woman, lying on her side, one arm flung out as if she'd been reaching for something before she fell. He dropped to one knee beside her, the rifle forgotten as he took in the damage. Her dress was torn and filthy, the fabric stiff with dried blood. Her face was swollen, one eye nearly shut, her lips split and crusted. Bruises mottled her throat in the unmistakable pattern of fingers. Someone had done this deliberately, methodically, and left her here to die. Thomas pressed two fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. For a long moment he felt nothing, just the terrible heat of her skin, the stillness that might already be death. Then, faint as a whisper, he felt it. A flutter. Weak, uneven, but alive. "Easy," he murmured, though she gave no sign of hearing. Her breathing was so shallow he had to watch her chest to be sure it moved at all. Blood had dried in her hair, matting the dark strands together, and when he carefully turned her head, he saw the gash along her scalp, deep enough that he could see bone through the clotted mess. Whoever had done this had meant to kill her. That she was still breathing was either a miracle or a mistake. Thomas straightened, scanning the trail again. No tracks but his own. No sign of a struggle here, which meant she'd been hurt somewhere else and dumped like trash for the sun and the vultures to finish. He looked down at her again, at the way her fingers were still curled as if holding on to something invisible, and made his decision. He couldn't leave her. Wouldn't. Even if every practical instinct screamed that picking up a half-dead stranger was asking for trouble, even if it meant questions he couldn't answer and complications he didn't need. A man didn't leave another human being to die in the dirt like an animal. The mare balked when he lifted the woman, nearly 200 pounds of dead weight that made his back protest and his arms shake, but he managed to drape her across the saddle, belly down, securing her as gently as he could before mounting behind her. It wasn't dignified, but it was the only way to keep her from sliding off during the ride. "Just hold on," he said quietly, though he didn't know if she could hear him. "We'll get you somewhere safe." The ranch was an hour away at a normal pace. He made it in 40 minutes, pushing the mare harder than he liked, one hand always on the woman's back to keep her steady. By the time the cluster of buildings came into view, house, barn, corral, his shirt was soaked through with sweat, and the woman hadn't moved once. Ada Holloway was in the vegetable garden when he rode up, her apron full of squash and her face already turning sharp with questions. She was 60 if she was a day, his housekeeper and cook for the past decade, and she had opinions about everything, most of them correct, which made her difficult to argue with. "What in heaven's name?" she started. Then her eyes went wide as she saw what he was carrying. The squash tumbled from her apron as she hurried over, her voice dropping to something quieter and harder. "Thomas, what happened?" "Found her on the trail," he said, dismounting carefully and lifting the woman down. She felt lighter now, or maybe he was just running on desperation. "Someone beat her near to death and left her." Ada's mouth thinned to a line as she looked the woman over, professional and grim. Before coming to the ranch, she'd been a midwife, and she'd seen plenty of violence in her time. "Bring her inside, quickly." He carried the woman into the house and laid her on the narrow bed in the spare room, a space that mostly held winter supplies and old furniture. Ada was already moving, barking orders as she gathered clean cloth, a basin of water, scissors, carbolic soap. "Strip that dress off her," she said, not looking up from where she was tearing an old sheet into bandages. "Carefully. I need to see what we're dealing with." Thomas hesitated. "Maybe you should—" "I will, but I need you to help me get it off without tearing her open worse. Now move." He obeyed, working as gently as he could to peel away the ruined fabric. The woman didn't stir, even when the cloth stuck to dried blood, and he had to use water to loosen it. Beneath the dress, her skin was a patchwork of bruises, ribs, stomach, shoulders. Someone had hit her repeatedly, with fists or boots, and hadn't stopped until she couldn't fight back. Ada sucked in a breath when she saw the full extent of it. Whoever did this wanted her dead. "I know," Thomas said quietly. "Then why isn't she?" "Don't know. Maybe they thought she was already gone." Ada didn't answer, just set to work cleaning the wounds with a precision that would have seemed cold if Thomas didn't know her better. She cared, deeply, fiercely, but she also understood that sentiment wouldn't save a life. Only steady hands and hard choices did that. She worked for over an hour, washing away the blood and dirt, stitching the gash on the woman's scalp with neat, tiny stitches that would leave the smallest scar possible. She wrapped the cracked ribs tightly, bound the worst of the cuts, and finally stepped back, wiping her hands on her apron. "She'll live," Ada said, and it sounded more like a challenge to fate than a comfort. "Maybe. If infection doesn't take her, and if those ribs don't puncture anything vital when she moves. But Thomas—" She turned to face him, her expression grave. "This woman is in trouble, bad trouble, and you just brought it straight to your door." "I couldn't leave her." "I know that. I'm not saying you should have, but you need to understand what you've done." Ada gestured toward the bed, where the woman lay pale and still beneath a clean blanket, her breathing a little stronger now, but still fragile. "Whoever hurt her is going to come looking, and when they find out she's alive—" "Then we'll deal with it," Thomas interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was iron underneath. "Right now she needs time to heal. After that, we'll figure out the rest." Ada studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You always were too stubborn for your own good." "Learned from the best," he said, and almost smiled. She shook her head, but there was affection in it. "I'll make broth. When she wakes, if she wakes, she'll need something in her stomach. You stay with her. If her breathing changes or if she starts burning up, you call me immediately." Thomas nodded and pulled a chair close to the bed, settling in to wait. Ada left, her footsteps fading toward the kitchen, and the room fell into a silence broken only by the woman's shallow breaths and the occasional creak of the house settling in the heat. He studied her face in the dim light filtering through the curtains. With the blood cleaned away and the worst of the swelling starting to fade, he could see she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe late 20s, with fine features that would have been pretty before someone had destroyed them. Her hands, resting on top of the blanket, were slender but marked with calluses. Working hands, not the soft palms of someone who'd lived an easy life. Who was she? And what had she done to earn this kind of fury? The questions chased themselves through his mind as the afternoon crawled toward evening. Ada brought broth and left it on the table, along with a pot of willow bark tea for the pain, then returned to her own work with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew better than to hover. Thomas stayed, watching the woman's chest rise and fall, willing her to keep breathing. Darkness came. He lit a lamp and kept vigil, occasionally dabbing her forehead with a cool cloth when the fever started to rise. Ada had warned him about infection, how it could take hold fast in wounds like these, turning skin red and angry, burning through a body until there was nothing left to save. But so far the woman's skin stayed pale, her breathing steady, and when he checked the bandages, there was no fresh blood seeping through. Midnight passed, then 1 in the morning, 2. And then, just as Thomas was starting to nod off in the chair, the woman's eyes opened. For a moment she just stared at the ceiling, unfocused and glassy. Then her gaze shifted, found him, and went wide with terror. She tried to scream, but all that came out was a choked, airless rasp. Her body jerked, trying to move, and she gasped in pain as her ribs protested. "Easy," Thomas said, keeping his voice low and calm. He didn't move from the chair, didn't reach for her. "Easy. You're safe. No one's going to hurt you." She didn't believe him. That much was clear in the way she pressed herself against the headboard, trembling violently, her good eye darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for escape. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts. "My name is Thomas Brennan," he continued, slow and steady. "I found you on the trail this afternoon. You were hurt, badly. I brought you here to my ranch so you wouldn't die in the desert. That's all. I'm not going to hurt you." The woman's mouth moved, but no sound came out. She raised one shaking hand to her throat, fingers brushing the bruises there, and her face crumpled with something worse than pain, memory. Thomas saw the moment she understood what had happened to her, saw the horror flood in, followed by despair so deep it looked like drowning. "You're safe here," he said again, softer now. "I promise you that. No one knows you're here but me and my housekeeper, Ada. She's the one who patched you up. You've been asleep for hours." The woman stared at him, and slowly, painfully slowly, the terror began to ease. Not vanish, just recede enough that she could breathe without shaking apart. Her hand dropped to the blanket, gripping it like an anchor. "Water," she whispered. The words scraped out of her, raw and broken. Thomas poured a cup from the pitcher Ada had left and held it out, careful not to move too quickly. The woman took it with both hands, her grip unsteady, and drank in small, careful sips. When she was done, she handed it back and closed her eyes, exhausted from that tiny effort. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently. For a long moment he thought she wouldn't answer, then, barely audible, "Eliza. Eliza," he repeated. "Can you tell me what happened to you?" Her eyes snapped open, sharp with fear again. "No. Someone tried to kill you. I know." Her voice was hoarse, each word clearly painful. "And if you're smart, you'll put me back where you found me and forget you ever saw me." Thomas frowned. "I'm not doing that." "You don't understand? Then help me understand." "I can't." She looked away, jaw tight. "I can't." He could see the conflict in her face, the desperate need to trust someone warring against the bone-deep certainty that trust would only get her killed. Or worse, get him killed. "All right," Thomas said quietly. "You don't have to tell me anything, but you're staying here until you can stand on your own 2 feet without falling over. After that, if you want to leave, I won't stop you. Deal?" Eliza stared at him, searching his face for the lie, the trap, the hidden blade. Whatever she saw there must have confused her because her expression shifted, still wary, but less certain. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help me?" Thomas thought about that. He could give her a dozen practical reasons, or talk about duty, or invoke some higher principle. But the truth was simpler and harder to explain. "Because someone should have," he said. Eliza's breath caught. For just a second, her face did something complicated, grief and relief and disbelief all tangled together. Then she looked away, blinking hard. "Thank you," she whispered. "Get some rest," Thomas said, standing. "Ada will bring you food in the morning. If you need anything before then, call out. I'll be right down the hall." He turned to go, but her voice stopped him. "Thomas?" He looked back. Eliza was watching him with something that might have been hope, buried under layers of fear and exhaustion. "If anyone comes looking for me, they won't find you," he said. "But if they do, then I'll handle it." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded slowly and sank back into the pillows. Thomas left the lamp burning low and stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door almost closed behind him. Ada was waiting in the kitchen, a cup of coffee in front of her despite the late hour. She looked up when he entered. "She awake?" "Barely. Scared out of her mind." Thomas poured himself a cup and sat across from her. "She won't say what happened." "Can't or won't?" "Both, I think." Ada took a sip of her coffee, considering. "You're getting yourself mixed up in something dangerous, Thomas. You know that." "I know. And you're doing it anyway." "Yes." She sighed. "Then I suppose we'd better be ready for whatever comes next." Thomas nodded, staring into his cup. Outside, the night was quiet, just crickets and the distant yip of coyotes. Peaceful. Normal. But he had the feeling that peace wouldn't last much longer. Somewhere out there, someone was looking for Eliza. Someone who'd already proven they were willing to kill to keep her quiet. And when they came, because they would come, Thomas would have to decide just how far he was willing to go to protect a woman he didn't know, for reasons he couldn't fully explain. He thought of her face when she'd asked him why. The disbelief that anyone would help without wanting something in return. Whatever she was running from, it had taught her that the world was a place where kindness didn't exist, where mercy was a lie, and every hand offered in friendship hid a knife. Thomas set his cup down with a quiet clink. Then he'd just have to prove her wrong. But the first 3 days passed in a haze of pain and fevered sleep. Eliza woke in fragments, sometimes to find Ada spooning broth between her lips, murmuring encouragement, sometimes to darkness and the pressure of clean bandages being wrapped around her ribs, sometimes to the low rumble of Thomas's voice, reading aloud from a book she couldn't focus on but found strangely comforting anyway. She didn't ask questions, didn't offer explanations, just accepted the care with the numb resignation of someone who'd stopped expecting to survive and didn't quite know what to do now that she was. But on the 4th morning, she woke with a clear head and a body that hurt less like dying and more like healing. The room was full of pale early light, and she could hear chickens clucking outside the window, the sound so ordinary and safe it made her chest tighten. Ada appeared shortly after, carrying a tray with eggs and toast and a cup of weak tea. "You're looking better," she said, setting the tray on the bedside table and helping Eliza sit up with a practiced efficiency that didn't invite refusal. "Color's back in your face. Fever broke last night." "Thank you," Eliza managed. Her voice was still rough, but stronger than before. "For everything." Ada waved that away. "Eat. You need your strength." Eliza obeyed, surprised by how hungry she was. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the toast warm, and she ate slowly, savoring every bite. When she was done, Ada took the tray and gave her a long, measuring look. "Thomas has gone into town for supplies," she said. "He'll be back this afternoon. Is there anything you need before then?" Eliza hesitated. "A mirror?" Ada's expression flickered. Sympathy, quickly controlled. "Are you sure?" "I need to see." "All right." Ada fetched a small hand mirror from the dresser and passed it over, then busied herself straightening the bedclothes to give Eliza privacy. Eliza lifted the mirror with shaking hands and looked. The face staring back was almost unrecognizable. The swelling had gone down enough that she could see both eyes now, but the bruises remained, purple and yellow and sickly green, spreading across her cheekbone and jaw. Her lip was scabbed where it had split, and the stitches along her hairline stood out starkly against her pale skin. But it was her eyes that shocked her most. They looked haunted, hollow, like something vital had been carved out and left behind only a brittle shell. She lowered the mirror slowly, her throat tight. "It'll heal," Ada said quietly, still not looking at her. "The bruises will fade. The cuts will scar, but not badly. You'll look like yourself again soon enough." "Will I?" Eliza asked, and wasn't sure she believed it. Ada finally met her eyes, and there was a fierceness there that startled Eliza into stillness. "Yes, because you survived. And survival, real survival, means more than just breathing. It means deciding that what was done to you doesn't get to define what you become." Eliza wanted to argue, wanted to say that it was easy to talk about survival when you weren't the one who'd been dragged into the desert and beaten until you couldn't remember your own name. But the words died in her throat, because she could see in Ada's face that this woman knew exactly what she was talking about. How? Eliza whispered. One day at a time, Ada said simply. One choice at a time. Starting with this. You're going to get out of that bed and you're going to walk to the window. Just a few steps. But you're going to do it under your own power because you're stronger than you think you are. Eliza looked at the window, maybe 10 feet away, but it might as well have been a mile. Every movement still hurt, her body a collection of aches and sharp pains that flared when she breathed wrong. But Ada was watching her with that steady, uncompromising gaze, and Eliza found herself pushing back the blankets and swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cool under her bare feet. She gripped the edge of the mattress and stood, slowly, her legs trembling with the effort. Ada didn't help, just stood nearby, ready to catch her if she fell, but not touching. Letting Eliza do this herself. 1 step, 2, 3. By the time she reached the window, Eliza was breathing hard and her vision had gone spotty at the edges. But she'd made it. She gripped the windowsill and looked out at the ranch spread before her. The barn, the corral, the rolling hills beyond painted gold by the morning sun. It was beautiful, quiet. The kind of place that felt like it existed outside of time, untouched by the ugliness of the world beyond its borders. This is a good place, Eliza said softly. Yes, Ada agreed. Thomas built it with his own hands, every board, every fence post. He's a good man. Stubborn as a mule, but good. Eliza heard the warning underneath the words. Don't hurt him. Don't bring your trouble here and destroy what he's built. I won't stay long, she said. As soon as I can travel, where will you go? Eliza didn't have an answer for that. She'd been so focused on surviving the next hour, the next day, that she hadn't let herself think about what came after. And now that she did, the future stretched out before her like a wasteland, empty and terrifying. Because the truth was, she had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The people who'd framed her controlled everything, the law, the newspapers, the very air she'd have to breathe if she tried to return to any kind of normal life. I don't know, she admitted. Ada was quiet for a moment. Then, you don't have to decide today. For now, just focus on getting strong enough to make that choice when the time comes. Eliza nodded, grateful beyond words for the reprieve. She made her way back to the bed with Ada's help this time, and by the time she was settled again, exhaustion was dragging at her like a lead weight. Sleep, Ada said gently. I'll wake you for lunch. Eliza closed her eyes and let the darkness take her, dreamless and still. Thomas returned just before sunset, the wagon loaded with sacks of flour and oats, crates of canned goods, and a new length of rope for the well. He was unloading the supplies when Ada came out to meet him, her face tight with worry. We need to talk, she said. Thomas set down the sack he was holding and followed her into the house, into the small parlor where they could speak privately. Ada shut the door and turned to face him, arms crossed. The woman, Eliza, she's stronger today, walked to the window on her own. That's good, Thomas said, confused by her tone. Isn't it? Yes. But Thomas, she's terrified. Not just of whoever hurt her, of everything. She doesn't trust us, doesn't trust this place, and she's already talking about leaving as soon as she can stand. She's welcome to go if that's what she wants. Is she? Ada challenged. Because I don't think you've thought this through. You brought her here without knowing who she is or what she's running from. And now she's healing, and soon she'll be strong enough to walk out that door, straight into whatever hell she's trying to escape. And if you let her do that, she'll die. You know it, and I know it. Thomas was silent because she was right. He'd seen it in Eliza's eyes, the certainty that there was no escape, no future, just borrowed time until the people hunting her caught up. What do you want me to do? He asked quietly. Lock her in until she tells me the truth? No, but you could give her a reason to stay, a reason to trust you. I barely know her. Then get to know her. Ada's voice softened. Thomas, that woman has been through something terrible. And I don't just mean the beating, I mean whatever led to it. She's carrying secrets that are eating her alive, and she won't survive them alone. She needs help, real help. And whether you want it or not, you're the one who picked her up off that trail, which means you're already involved. Thomas rubbed his face, suddenly tired. She won't talk to me. Then don't make her talk, just be there. Show her that not everyone in this world is out to hurt her. Let her see that she's safe here, truly safe, and maybe she'll start to believe it. It sounded simple when Ada said it, but Thomas knew better. Trust wasn't something you could force or hurry. It had to be earned, slowly and carefully, and even then it could shatter in an instant. But he also knew that Ada was right. Eliza needed help, and for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, Thomas wanted to be the one to give it. "All right," he said. "I'll try." Ada nodded, satisfied. "Good. Now come help me with dinner, and when you see her, act normal. Don't hover, don't push, just let her know she's welcome." Thomas did as he was told, though acting normal proved harder than expected when Eliza appeared in the kitchen doorway that evening, pale and unsteady but upright. She'd changed into one of Ada's spare dresses, too big on her thin frame but clean and mended, and her hair had been brushed and pinned back from her face. She looked fragile, breakable, but there was something in the set of her jaw that told Thomas she was tougher than she looked. "I hope you don't mind," she said, her voice still rough. "Ada said I could join you for dinner." "Of course," Thomas said, standing quickly. "Here, sit." He pulled out a chair for her, and Eliza lowered herself into it with visible relief. Ada set a plate in front of her, roast chicken, potatoes, greens, and Eliza stared at it like she couldn't quite believe it was real. "Thank you," she whispered. They ate in relative silence, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable so much as careful. Thomas watched Eliza from the corner of his eye, noting the way she ate slowly, methodically, as if she'd learned not to waste a single bite. The way her gaze kept darting to the door, checking the shadows. When dinner was finished, Ada cleared the plates and brought out a pot of coffee. Eliza accepted a cup with both hands, cradling the warmth, and finally looked directly at Thomas for the first time since sitting down. "Ada says you went into town today," she said, "just for supplies." "Did you—" She hesitated, then forced the words out. "Did you hear anything about anyone looking for someone?" Thomas kept his expression neutral. "No. Why? Should I have?" Eliza looked down at her coffee, her fingers tightening around the cup. "No, I just— Never mind." But Thomas could see the fear in her, raw and immediate. She was expecting someone to come, expecting to be found. And suddenly, he realized he needed to know who she was afraid of. Not just for her sake, but for his own. "Eliza, wollte," he said gently, "if there's something I should know, if there's danger coming here, I'd rather be prepared." She went very still. For a long moment she didn't speak, didn't even breathe. Then quietly, "You should have left me in the desert." "I couldn't." "You should have," her voice cracked. "Because now you're in danger too, both of you. And I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, but I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to keep you safe." Thomas reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his own. She flinched but didn't pull away. "Then let me help," he said. "Tell me what happened. Let me help you figure this out." Eliza looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He could see the war happening inside her, the desperate need to trust someone fighting against the terror of what that trust might cost. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to talk. "My name is Eliza Caldwell," she said, "and I'm wanted for murder." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and choking. Thomas didn't move, didn't pull his hand away, though he felt Ada go rigid beside him. Eliza stared at the table, her shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow, and when she spoke again her voice was hollow. "I was a bank teller in Sacramento. I'd worked there for 3 years. Good, honest work. I was careful with the numbers, never made mistakes, and people trusted me with their money. That was important to me. Trust." She laughed, bitter and broken. "Stupid, wasn't it?" "It wasn't stupid," Thomas said quietly. Eliza shook her head. "About 6 months ago, I started noticing discrepancies. Small ones at first, a few dollars here and there that didn't match the ledgers. I thought maybe I'd made an error, so I went back through the books. But the numbers didn't add up. Someone was moving money, hiding it in accounts that shouldn't exist, and covering their tracks just well enough that no one else had noticed." Ada leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "How much?" "Thousands," Eliza said. Maybe tens of thousands by the time I realized what I was seeing. It was careful, methodical. Whoever was doing it knew exactly how the system worked and how to exploit it. I should have gone to the bank manager immediately, should have reported it and let someone else handle it. But I was proud. I thought if I could prove who was responsible, if I could bring them solid evidence, it would mean something, that I'd be protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Thomas could hear the self-recrimination in her voice, the way she blamed herself for what came next. What did you do? I started keeping my own records. Every suspicious transaction, every altered entry, I copied it all down and hid it at home. It took me 2 months to trace the pattern back to its source. 2 men, Marcus Holcomb, one of the senior accountants, and Gideon Rourke, a loan officer with connections all over the city. They were bleeding the bank dry, little by little, and funneling the money into private accounts under false names. Did you confront them? Ada asked. No. I went to the city marshal first, I thought. Eliza's voice cracked, and she paused to steady herself. I thought if I brought him proof, he'd arrest them, that it would be over. But the marshal told me I needed more than copies. He said I needed the original ledgers, the ones Holcomb kept locked in his office. Otherwise, it was just my word against 2 respected men, and no one would believe me. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. He could already see where this was going, could feel the shape of the trap closing around her. So I waited until everyone had gone home one night, and I went back to the bank. I had a key. All the tellers did in case we needed to work late. I found Holcomb's office and picked the lock on his desk drawer. It wasn't hard. And inside, there they were. All the original records showing every theft, every false account, everything I needed to prove what they'd done. But someone caught you, Thomas said. Not me. I was careful. I made it out of the building without anyone seeing, but the next morning, when I went to work, there were police everywhere. Marcus Holcomb was dead. Someone had shot him in his office the night before, and the ledgers, the ones I'd taken, were gone. They said it was robbery, a break-in, and then they found the key to the office in my apartment, along with $500 in cash I'd never seen before in my life. Ada's breath hissed out. They framed you. Gideon Rourke, Eliza said, and the name came out like poison. He must have gone to the office after I left. Maybe he knew I was getting close, or maybe Holcomb tried to back out of their arrangement. Either way, Rourke killed him and made it look like I'd done it. He planted evidence in my home, told the police I'd been embezzling money and that Holcomb had discovered it. When they came to arrest me, I ran. I didn't know what else to do. Thomas could picture it too clearly. This woman, terrified and desperate, fleeing through the streets with the whole city turned against her. How did you end up in the desert? Eliza's hands were shaking now, and she pulled them into her lap, hidden beneath the table. I made it out of Sacramento and headed south, thinking I could disappear in the smaller towns. But Rourke sent men after me, hired thugs. They caught me outside Weaverville 3 days ago, dragged me into the desert, and... She stopped, her breathing ragged. Thomas waited, giving her time. They were supposed to kill me, she finally whispered. One of them, the big one with the scar. He said Rourke wanted it done quiet. No body to find, no questions to answer. Just another woman who disappeared and didn't matter. They beat me until I couldn't fight anymore, and then they left me there to die slow. I think they thought it was kinder than a bullet. Or maybe they just wanted me to suffer. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the distant sound of wind outside. Thomas felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. Not fear, but fury. The kind that burned slow and didn't fade. This Gideon Rourke, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Does he know you're alive? I don't know. Maybe. If his men came back to check... Eliza looked up, and her eyes were desperate. That's why I have to leave. If he finds out I survived, he'll send someone else, and I won't let you get hurt because of me. I won't. Where would you go? Ada asked, practical even now. You're wanted for murder. Every lawman between here and Sacramento will be looking for you. You wouldn't make it 10 miles. Then I'll go somewhere they won't look. Mexico, maybe. Or north, into the territories. I'll change my name, my appearance, and spend the rest of your life running, Thomas finished. Always looking over your shoulder, never able to stop, never able to trust anyone. Is that the future you want? Eliza's face crumpled. It's the only future I have. No, Thomas said, and the certainty in his voice surprised even himself. It's not. She stared at him, confusion and hope warring in her expression. What are you saying? I'm saying you didn't kill anyone. You have proof that Rourke is the real criminal, or you did before he stole it, which means there's still evidence out there, still a way to clear your name. The ledgers are gone, Eliza said bitterly. Rourke has them, or he's destroyed them by now. Without those, are they the only proof? Eliza hesitated. I made copies, like I said, but the marshal told me copies wouldn't be enough. Where are the copies now? Hidden, in Sacramento. I didn't dare take them with me when I ran. If Rourke's men had found them, it would have been over. I buried them in a place only I know. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his mind already working through possibilities. Then we get them back. Are you insane? Eliza's voice rose, sharp with panic. Sacramento is crawling with people who want me dead. The moment I set foot in that city, you won't be alone, Thomas interrupted. I'll go with you. No. The word was flat, absolute. Absolutely not. I won't let you risk your life for me. It's not your decision to make, Thomas said, matching her tone. You're sitting at my table, eating my food, sleeping under my roof. That makes you my responsibility, and I don't abandon people who need help. Thomas, Ada started, but he held up a hand. I know what I'm doing, Ada, or at least I know what needs to be done. This woman was beaten and left for dead because she tried to do the right thing. Now she's got a choice: spend the rest of her life running scared or fight back. And if she chooses to fight, she shouldn't have to do it alone. Eliza was staring at him like he'd grown a second head. Why? Why would you do this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Maybe not, Thomas said. But I know what it's like to feel like the world has decided you don't matter. And I know that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand beside you to change everything. There was a long silence. Eliza looked down at her hands, her jaw working as she struggled with something Thomas couldn't name. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear her. I had the proof in my hands, all of it, everything I needed to show the world what Rourke had done. And I walked away from Holcomb's office thinking I was being careful, thinking I was protecting myself. But if I'd just stayed, if I'd gone straight to the marshal that night instead of waiting until morning, maybe Holcomb would still be alive. Maybe none of this would have happened. Or maybe Rourke would have killed you both, Ada said, her voice gentle but firm. You can't know what might have been, Eliza. You can only decide what happens next. Eliza looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. And you think we can just walk into Sacramento, find my hidden copies, and make everything right? That Rourke won't see us coming? No, Thomas admitted. I think it'll be dangerous. I think there's a good chance we'll fail, but I also think it's better than the alternative. Because if you run now, you'll never stop running, and eventually they'll catch you. Eliza closed her eyes, and for a moment Thomas thought she might refuse. Thought she might gather what little strength she had and walk out that door, disappearing into the night rather than risk dragging him into her nightmare. But when she opened her eyes again, there was something different in them, something harder, determined. The copies are hidden in the basement of a boarding house where I used to live, she said. The landlady, Mrs. Chen, she's a good woman. She'd help us if she could. But Rourke's men might be watching the place. And even if we get the copies, we'd need to find someone willing to act on them, someone Rourke doesn't own. Then we'll find that person, Thomas said, one step at a time. Ada stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. If you're set on this fool errand, you'll need supplies, food, water, a plan, and Eliza needs at least another week before she's strong enough to travel. I can travel now, Eliza protested. You can barely walk to the window without collapsing, Ada shot back. Give yourself time to heal. Another week won't make a difference. It might, Eliza said. Every day I'm here is another day Rourke could find me, find you. Thomas shook his head. We're miles from anywhere and no one knows you're here. Ada's right. You need to be strong enough to move fast when the time comes. Use the week, rest, heal, and then we'll go. Eliza looked between them, and slowly, reluctantly, she nodded. 1 week. But if anything happens, if you see anyone suspicious, or if word reaches town about me, we leave immediately. I won't risk your lives any more than I already have." "Agreed," Thomas said, though he had no intention of letting fear dictate their timeline. If Rourke's men came, they'd deal with it, but he didn't say that out loud. Ada began clearing the dishes, her movements brisk and practical. "I'll make a list of what we'll need. Thomas, you'll have to ride into town tomorrow and buy supplies without raising suspicion. And Eliza." She turned, fixing the younger woman with a stern look. "You'll eat 3 meals a day, sleep as much as your body needs, and stop trying to leave this house before you're ready. Understood?" A ghost of a smile flickered across Eliza's face. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." Ada's expression softened just slightly. "You're braver than you think, girl. Don't forget that." Eliza didn't answer, but Thomas saw the way her shoulders straightened, just a fraction, as if hearing someone say she was brave made it a little more possible to believe. That night, after Eliza had retreated to her room and Ada had gone to bed, Thomas sat alone in the parlor with a glass of whiskey he didn't drink. He stared into the darkness beyond the window and thought about what he'd just committed himself to. He wasn't a fool. He knew this could go wrong in 100 different ways. Knew that Gideon Rourke was clearly a man with money, power, and the willingness to kill anyone who threatened him. Knew that walking into Sacramento with a wanted woman was the kind of decision that could get them both hanged. But he also knew he couldn't live with himself if he sent Eliza away. Couldn't look in the mirror knowing he'd saved her life only to abandon her when things got complicated. He thought of the way she'd looked when she'd asked him why he was helping her. The disbelief. The bone-deep certainty that kindness was a lie people told to make themselves feel better. Someone had taught her that. Rourke, maybe, or the world in general. And Thomas was going to prove them wrong. He finished the whiskey in one burning swallow and went to bed. The next morning, Thomas rode into Weaverville with Ada's list tucked in his pocket and his eyes open for trouble. The town was small, barely 300 people, but it was the closest settlement to his ranch, and if Rourke's men had been asking questions, this is where they'd start. He tied his horse outside the general store and went inside, nodding to the clerk as he began gathering supplies. Flour, coffee, dried beans, salted pork. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would suggest he was preparing for a journey. "Morning, Thomas," the clerk said. A middle-aged man named Dawson, who'd run the store for as long as Thomas could remember. "Been a while since we saw you in town." "Had everything I needed at the ranch," Thomas replied, keeping his tone casual. "How's business?" "Slow. Always slow this time of year." Dawson began tallying up the purchases, his hands quick and practiced. "Say, you hear about the trouble over in Sacramento?" Thomas's stomach tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Can't say I have. What happened?" "Murder. Some woman killed a bank accountant and made off with a pile of money. They're saying she's armed and dangerous. Got a reward posted for her capture. $500. "That's so," Thomas said, loading the supplies into a crate. "They catch her yet?" "Not last I heard. Sheriff thinks she might have headed south, maybe into the desert. Fool thing to do if you ask me. Woman like that wouldn't last a day out there." "Probably not," Thomas agreed, handing over payment. "Anything else I should know about?" Dawson shrugged. "Just the usual gossip. Oh, and there were some men through here a few days back, rough-looking types. Asked if anyone had seen a woman traveling alone. Didn't say why, but they didn't strike me as lawmen." Thomas forced himself to stay relaxed. "What'd you tell them?" "Truth. Haven't seen anyone like that. They moved on pretty quick after." Dawson paused, then added quietly, "Thomas, if you do see a stranger, especially a woman, you be careful. Men like that don't ask questions for friendly reasons." "Appreciate the warning," Thomas said, and meant it. He gathered his supplies and headed back to the wagon, his mind racing. So Rourke's men had been here, had asked questions. But they'd moved on, which meant they didn't know Eliza was at the ranch. Not yet, but it was only a matter of time. He drove back faster than was wise, the wagon bouncing over the rutted road, and found Ada waiting on the porch with her arms crossed. "Well?" she asked as he climbed down. "They were here 3 days ago, looking for a woman traveling alone." Ada's face went tight. "Did they?" Dawson didn't tell them anything because he didn't know anything, but they're still looking, and if they come back, Then we'd better be ready. Ada glanced toward the house where Eliza was likely resting, unaware of how close danger had come. How much time do you think we have? A week? Maybe less? Depends on whether they're working a grid or just following rumors. Thomas began unloading the wagon, his movements automatic. We need to move up the timeline. Get Eliza strong enough to travel in the next few days instead of a full week. She's not ready. She'll have to be. Ada helped him carry the supplies inside, and together they put everything away without speaking. When they were done, Ada turned to him with an expression he recognized, the one that meant she was about to say something he wouldn't like. Thomas, I need you to think very carefully about what you're doing. This isn't just about helping a woman in trouble anymore. This is about going up against men who have already killed once and won't hesitate to do it again. Men who have the law on their side, whether they deserve it or not. If this goes wrong, I know, Thomas interrupted. I know the risks, Ada, but I also know I can't send her out there alone. Why not? The question was blunt, almost harsh. Why is this woman's life worth more than yours? You've built something here, Thomas. A good life, a safe life, and you're willing to throw it all away for someone you met less than a week ago. I need to understand why. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, searching for words that felt true. Finally, he said, You remember when I first came here, after the war? Ada's expression softened. Yes? I was broken, half dead inside. Didn't care if I lived or died, and some days I hoped I wouldn't wake up. And you could have turned me away, probably should have. But you didn't. You gave me work, gave me a reason to get out of bed, and slowly, piece by piece, you helped me remember how to be human again. That was different, Ada said quietly. Was it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks the same. Someone who needed help. Someone the world had chewed up and spit out, and someone willing to offer a hand instead of walking past. Thomas met her eyes. You saved my life, Ada. Maybe now it's my turn to save someone else's. Ada looked away, blinking hard. When she spoke again, her voice was rough. You're going to get yourself killed, you stubborn fool. Maybe, but I'd rather die trying to do something right than live knowing I did nothing. And if Eliza gets killed too? If your help gets her killed? Then at least she won't die alone, and at least she'll die fighting instead of running. Ada shook her head, but there was no anger in it, just resignation. You've made up your mind, haven't you? Yes. Then I suppose I can't stop you, she sighed, but I can make sure you don't go unprepared. Come on, we have work to do. Over the next 3 days, the ranch became a hive of quiet preparation. Thomas cleaned and oiled his rifle, checked the horses' shoes, and mapped out a route to Sacramento that would keep them off the main roads. Ada packed food that would keep, hardtack, jerky, dried fruit, and sewed a hidden pocket into Eliza's dress where she could carry important documents. And Eliza, for her part, pushed herself harder than Thomas thought wise. She forced herself to walk the perimeter of the house twice a day, then 3 times, ignoring the pain that still flared in her ribs and the dizziness that sometimes made her stumble. She practiced mounting and dismounting from a horse until she could do it without gasping. She even insisted on learning to shoot, and Thomas spent an afternoon teaching her the basics of handling the small revolver Ada kept in a drawer. You're not going to become a sharpshooter in 3 days, he warned, as she missed the target for the 5th time in a row. I don't need to be a sharpshooter, Eliza replied, steadying her grip. I just need to be able to point it in the right direction and pull the trigger. The 6th shot hit the edge of the target, and Eliza smiled, a real smile, fierce and satisfied. On the 4th night, Thomas found her sitting on the porch steps, staring up at the stars. He hesitated, then sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. Couldn't sleep? He asked. Too much on my mind. Eliza glanced at him. You should still change your mind, you know. It's not too late. Yes, it is. She shook her head. You're risking everything for me, and you don't even know if I'm telling the truth. What if I'm lying? What if I really did kill Marcus Holcomb? Did you? No. But how do you know that? Thomas considered the question seriously. I don't. Not for certain. But I've spent enough time around liars to recognize one, and you're not it. You're scared and you're desperate, but you're not lying. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then softly, My mother used to say that the measure of a person isn't what they do when things are easy. It's what they do when everything falls apart. When I was in that desert, beaten and bleeding, I thought I'd reached the end, that there was nothing left but dying. And then you came. She turned to look at him fully, her eyes bright in the moonlight. You didn't have to stop. Didn't have to help, but you did. And now you're willing to risk your life to help me clear my name. I don't know how to repay that. You don't have to repay it, Thomas said. Just survive. That's enough. Is it? Eliza asked, and there was something raw in her voice. Because I'm not sure survival is enough anymore. I want my life back, my name. I want to be able to walk through a town without looking over my shoulder. I want to sleep without nightmares, and I want... She stopped, swallowing hard. What? I want the people who did this to me to pay, she said, and the words came out like a vow. Not just Rourke. All of them. Everyone who helped him, everyone who looked the other way, everyone who decided my life didn't matter. I want them to face what they've done. Thomas heard the steel beneath the words and recognized it. It was the same hardness he'd carried after the war, the need for justice, for balance, for the world to acknowledge that wrongs had been committed and couldn't be ignored. Then we'll make them pay, he said simply. Eliza looked at him for a long moment, searching his face. Then she reached out and took his hand, squeezing once before letting go. Thank you, she whispered. They sat together in comfortable silence as the stars wheeled overhead and the night insects sang their endless song. And Thomas thought that maybe, just maybe, this was what Ada had meant all those years ago when she told him that saving someone else's life was the best way to save your own. On the fifth morning, Thomas woke to find Ada already up and brewing coffee, her face set in grim determination. Today, she said without preamble, you leave today. Eliza's not ready. She's as ready as she'll ever be, and you're out of time. Ada handed him a cup and nodded toward the window. There's a rider coming, been watching him for the past 10 minutes. He's circling, like he's looking for something. Thomas's blood went cold. He set down the cup and grabbed his rifle, moving to the window to look out. Sure enough, there was a man on horseback maybe half a mile out, moving slowly along the ridgeline. He was too far away to make out details, but the way he was searching the landscape was unmistakable. One of Rourke's men? Thomas asked. Maybe. Or maybe just a drifter, but we can't take that chance. Ada's voice was steady, but Thomas could hear the fear beneath it. Wake Eliza, get the horses ready. I'll pack the last of the food. Thomas didn't argue. He went to Eliza's room and knocked once before entering. She was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with her boots half laced. I heard, she said. Someone's out there. We're leaving, now. She nodded and finished with her boots, moving with a speed that belied her still healing body. Within minutes, she was dressed and had gathered the few possessions she'd accumulated, a spare dress, the revolver Thomas had given her, and a worn photograph of two people Thomas assumed were her parents. They met Ada in the kitchen, where she was tying off saddlebags bulging with supplies. She pressed a small leather pouch into Eliza's hands. Money, she said. Not much, but enough to get you started if things go wrong. And this, she handed over a folded piece of paper. It's a letter of introduction to my cousin in Sacramento, Mara Winslow. She's a nurse and she knows people. If you need help, find her. Eliza's eyes filled with tears. Ada, Don't. Ada pulled her into a fierce hug. Just promise me you'll come back safe, both of you. We will, Thomas said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. They led the horses out through the back of the property, keeping the barn between them and the distant rider. Thomas helped Eliza mount and she settled into the saddle with only a small grimace of pain. Ready? He asked. Eliza looked back at the ranch, at the house that had been her sanctuary, at Ada standing on the porch watching them go, and nodded. Ready. They rode south, away from the ridgeline and the watching stranger, pushing the horses as fast as Eliza could manage. Behind them, the ranch grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by distance and the rolling hills. And ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, Sacramento waited with all its dangers and secrets. Thomas glanced at Eliza, saw the determination in the set of her shoulders, and felt something settle in his chest. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. That would have to be enough. They rode hard for the first hour, pushing through scrub oak and manzanita that scratched at their legs and caught in the horses' manes. Thomas kept them off the main trail, following deer paths and dry creek beds that wound through the hills like veins through stone. Behind them, the dust of their passage hung in the still air, and Thomas knew that anyone with half a tracker's sense could follow if they wanted to badly enough. Eliza didn't complain, though he could see the strain in her face, the way she held herself rigid in the saddle, the white-knuckled grip on the reins. Every jolt sent pain through her healing ribs, but she kept pace without a word of protest. When they finally stopped to rest the horses near a stand of cottonwoods, Eliza dismounted in one smooth motion and immediately bent double, hands on her knees, breathing hard. "You all right?" Thomas asked, offering his canteen. She took it and drank deeply before answering. "Fine. Just need a minute." "We can rest longer if you need to." "No." She straightened, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "The longer we wait, the more time we give them to find our trail. I can manage." Thomas studied her for a moment, seeing the truth beneath the brave words. She was hurting, badly, but she was also right. They couldn't afford to linger. "Sacramento's 3 days' ride from here, if we push it," he said, pulling out the rough map he'd sketched based on memory and conversations with other ranchers. "But we'll need to be careful once we get close to the city. That's where Rourke's influence will be strongest." Eliza nodded, coming to stand beside him and look at the map. "We should approach from the east, through the neighborhoods near the river. That's where the boarding house is, Mrs. Chen's place. It's in a part of town the wealthy folks don't pay much attention to. Working people, immigrants, anyone trying to make an honest living without much to show for it. And Rourke's men? Will they be watching it? Maybe. Probably." Eliza's jaw tightened. "But I don't have a choice. The evidence is there, hidden in a loose board under the stairs in the basement. I checked it 3 times before I ran, made sure no one could find it by accident. If it's still there, it will be," Thomas said with more confidence than he felt. "We'll get it, and then we'll find someone who can use it. Ada's cousin, this Mara Winslow. You think she can help?" "I don't know. I've never met her, but if Ada trusts her, that's enough for me." Eliza folded the map carefully and handed it back. "Thomas, when we get there, if things go wrong, if Rourke's men find us, you run. Don't try to fight them all, just run and save yourself." "Not a chance. I'm serious. This is my fight, not yours. You've already done more than anyone had a right to ask. I won't let you die for me." Thomas met her eyes, his expression unyielding. "Then don't give me a reason to. Stay close, stay smart, and we'll both walk out of this alive." Eliza looked like she wanted to argue, but something in his tone stopped her. Instead, she nodded once, sharp and final, and moved to check her horse's saddle. They rode on as the sun climbed higher, the heat building until it felt like riding through an oven. Thomas led them through a series of small towns, places barely big enough to have names, just a general store and a saloon and a scattering of houses. They stopped only once to buy grain for the horses and refill their water, and Thomas paid in cash without offering names or conversation. The store owner barely looked at them, too busy with his ledger to care about 2 dusty travelers passing through. That night they made camp in a rocky outcrop that offered shelter from 3 sides and a clear view of anyone approaching from the 4th. Thomas built a small fire, just enough to heat coffee and warm the beans Ada had packed, and they ate in silence while the stars came out one by one. "Tell me about the ranch," Eliza said suddenly, breaking the quiet. She was sitting with her back against a boulder, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. "How long have you had it?" Thomas poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers flare and die. 15 years, give or take. Bought the land cheap after the war. No one wanted it. Too rocky, too dry, too far from anywhere that mattered. But I didn't need much. Just space and silence." "You were a soldier?" "For a while. Cavalry mostly. Spent 3 years riding through places I'd rather forget, doing things I wish I hadn't." He paused, then added quietly, "When it was over, I couldn't go back to who I'd been before. Couldn't pretend the world was the same place. So I came west and started building something new." Eliza was quiet for a moment, absorbing that. Did it help, starting over? "Eventually. Took a long time, though, and I had help, Ada mostly. She saw me at my worst and didn't flinch. Just put me to work and let me heal in my own time. Thomas looked up at her. What about you? Where are you from? Sacramento originally. My parents ran a small bookshop near the river. They died when I was 17. Cholera took half the neighborhood that year. I kept the shop going for a while, but I wasn't good at it like they were. Eventually I had to sell, and I took the job at the bank because it was steady work, and I needed to survive. She smiled, bitter and sad. I thought if I worked hard enough, kept my head down, followed the rules, I'd be safe. Turns out the world doesn't care how hard you work if someone powerful decides you're in the way. It should, Thomas said, and maybe after this it will. At least for you. Maybe. Eliza didn't sound convinced. She set down her cup and wrapped her arms around her knees, staring into the fire. I keep thinking about Marcus Holcomb, about how he looked the last time I saw him alive. He wasn't a good man. He was stealing, lying, helping Rourke rob people who trusted the bank. But he didn't deserve to die like that. And now I'm the only one left who knows the truth. And if I can't prove it, if we can't find that evidence, then he'll just be another forgotten name and I'll be the villain in a story I didn't write. We'll find it, Thomas said firmly, and we'll make sure people know what really happened. Eliza looked at him, her eyes dark in the firelight. You believe that? Even now when we're riding straight into the lion's den? I have to believe it, otherwise none of this means anything. She held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, then I'll believe it too. They took turns keeping watch that night, and when it was Thomas's turn, he sat with his rifle across his knees and listened to the desert breathe around him. Coyotes called in the distance, their yips echoing off the rocks, and somewhere an owl hunted on silent wings. Eliza slept fitfully, twitching and murmuring in her sleep, and twice Thomas heard her cry out softly before falling silent again. He wondered what she was dreaming about, wondered if she saw Rourke's men in her nightmares, or the desert where they'd left her to die, or the moment she'd realized no one was coming to save her. When dawn came, pale and hesitant, Thomas woke her gently and they broke camp without speaking. The second day's ride was harder than the first. The terrain grew rougher, the heat more oppressive, and Eliza's strength was clearly flagging. But she never asked to stop, never showed weakness except in the tightness around her eyes and the careful way she moved. They saw other travelers that day, a family in a covered wagon heading west, the father's face grim and hopeful in equal measure. A pair of prospectors leading pack mules laden with equipment, talking loudly about a strike they were sure would make them rich. A circuit preacher on a tired mule, his black coat dusty and his Bible clutched like a weapon. None of them paid Thomas and Eliza any mind. Just two more people moving through the landscape, anonymous and unremarkable. But that changed on the third day. They were less than 10 miles from Sacramento, following a road that ran parallel to the river, when Thomas spotted the dust cloud behind them. He reined in and turned to look, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun, and felt his stomach drop. 3 riders, moving fast and closing the distance. Eliza, he said quietly, and something in his tone made her turn immediately. She saw the riders and went pale. It's them. It has to be. Maybe just travelers. No. Her voice was sharp with certainty. Look at the way they're riding. They're not just traveling, they're hunting. Thomas cursed under his breath and scanned the road ahead. They were in open country here, no cover except for scattered scrub and the occasional boulder. If they tried to run, the riders would run them down within minutes. But if they stood and fought, 3 against 2, and one of those 2 barely healed from a beating, the odds weren't good. The river, Eliza said suddenly, pointing to where the water glinted through a break in the trees. If we can reach it, we can lose them in the shallows. They won't be able to track us through water. It was a desperate plan, but Thomas couldn't think of a better one. Go. Now. They spurred their horses forward, leaving the road and plunging down the embankment toward the river. Behind them, a shout went up. The riders had spotted them breaking away and were giving chase. Thomas risked a glance back and saw them clearly now. 3 men, hard-faced and armed, one of them pointing in their direction and yelling something Thomas couldn't hear over the pounding of hooves. The river appeared ahead, brown and swift with snowmelt from the mountains. Thomas hit the water first, the cold shocking after days of desert heat, and his horse balked for a second before plunging in. Eliza followed, and they pushed upstream, the current fighting them with every step. "Keep going!" Thomas shouted over the rush of water. "Don't stop!" Behind them, the riders reached the riverbank and paused, their horses dancing nervously at the water's edge. One of them, a big man with a scarred face that made Thomas's blood run cold, raised a rifle and fired. The shot went wide, kicking up a spray of water 10 feet to their left. Thomas heard Eliza gasp and urged his horse faster, angling toward the far bank where a tangle of willows offered cover. Another shot. This one closer, close enough that Thomas felt the wind of its passing. They reached the willows and crashed through, branches whipping at their faces and tearing at their clothes. Thomas didn't slow down until they were deep in the thicket, the river hidden behind a wall of green. "Off the horses," he commanded, swinging down. "We go on foot from here." Eliza dismounted, and they led the horses deeper into the undergrowth, moving as quietly as possible. Behind them, Thomas could hear the riders entering the water, their voices carrying over the sound of the current. "Spread out! They can't have gone far." "Forget the horses. Find the woman. Rourke wants her alive." Thomas and Eliza exchanged a look. Alive. That was something, at least. It meant they wouldn't shoot to kill. Not at first. They moved through the willows like ghosts, using every trick Thomas had learned during the war. Step on solid ground, not loose dirt. Avoid breaking branches. Breathe shallow and quiet. Eliza followed his lead without question, her face set in grim concentration. The voices of the riders grew louder, then faded, then grew loud again as the men quartered the area. Thomas could hear them crashing through the brush, cursing when the thorns caught their clothes, calling to each other in frustration. "She's here somewhere. Keep looking." Thomas led Eliza to a dense thicket of blackberry brambles and gestured for her to crawl inside. She hesitated. The thorns were vicious, the space barely big enough for one person, let alone two, but Thomas gave her a look that brooked no argument. "Get in. Stay quiet. Don't move until I come back." "Where are you going?" she whispered, fear sharp in her eyes. "To draw them away. If they're chasing me, they're not looking for you." "Thomas, no!" But he was already moving, slipping away through the trees before she could stop him. He heard her call his name once, softly, and then silence. Thomas circled wide, putting distance between himself and Eliza's hiding place, and then deliberately stepped on a dry branch. It snapped with a crack that echoed through the stillness. Immediately, one of the riders shouted, "Over there! I heard something!" Thomas ran, making just enough noise to be followed, but not so much that he seemed like he was trying to be caught. He led them away from the river, away from Eliza, deeper into the wild country where he had the advantage. Behind him, the riders crashed through the undergrowth like angry bears, too focused on the chase to realize they were being led. Thomas ran for 10 minutes, maybe 15, until his lungs burned and his legs ached. Then he found what he was looking for, a rocky outcrop with a narrow gap between two boulders, just wide enough for a man to slip through but too tight for horses. He squeezed into the gap and kept going, emerging on the other side into a small clearing. The riders were close now, so close he could hear them breathing hard, cursing as their horses balked at the rocks. "He went through there!" "Then get off your horse and follow him, you idiot!" Thomas didn't wait to hear more. He sprinted across the clearing and into the trees on the far side, using every ounce of speed he had left. Behind him, he heard boots hitting the ground as at least two of the men dismounted to give chase on foot. Good, that evened the odds a little. Thomas ran until he found a fallen log, massive and rotting, and dove behind it. He pulled his rifle around and sighted down the barrel, waiting as the footsteps grew closer. The first man appeared young, maybe 25, with a patchy beard and wild eyes. He was holding a pistol and scanning the trees, breathing hard. "Come out!" he yelled. "We know you're here!" Thomas stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The second man appeared beside the first, older, leaner, with a face like a hatchet. Whoa. Spread out. He can't have gone far. They moved forward, cautious now, their guns raised. Thomas waited until they were 10 feet away, then stood up in one smooth motion and fired a shot into the air. The younger man yelped and dove for cover. The older one spun toward Thomas, raising his pistol, but Thomas was already moving, ducking behind the log and running in a new direction, back toward where he'd left the horses. More shots rang out, wild and panicked. None of them came close. Thomas ran until he couldn't hear pursuit anymore, then slowed to a jog, then a walk. His heart was hammering and his hands were shaking, adrenaline flooding his system in waves. But he'd done it. He'd led them away from Eliza. Now he just had to get back to her before they realized they'd been played. He circled back through the wilderness, moving carefully now, listening for any sign of the riders. It took him nearly an hour to reach the river again, and by then the sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. He found the blackberry thicket and called softly, "Eliza, it's me. You can come out." For a long moment there was nothing. Then the brambles rustled and Eliza emerged, scratched and bleeding from a dozen small cuts, her dress torn and her hair wild. But she was whole and unhurt otherwise. She looked at Thomas, took in his disheveled appearance and the rifle still in his hands, and her face crumpled with relief. "You came back," she whispered. "Of course I came back." Thomas reached out and gently pulled a thorn from her hair. "You all right?" "I heard shooting. I thought—" She stopped, her breath hitching. "I thought they'd killed you." "Takes more than 3 hired guns to put me down," Thomas said, trying for lightness and not quite succeeding. "Come on. We need to keep moving. They'll regroup and start searching again once they realize I gave them the slip." They found the horses where they'd left them, still hidden in the willows, and mounted up. Thomas led them away from the river this time, cutting north through farmland and orchards where the trees provided cover and the smell of ripening fruit hung heavy in the air. They rode until full dark, then made a cold camp in an abandoned barn that smelled of hay and mice. No fire, no hot food, just jerky and water, and the horses tied loosely in case they needed to leave in a hurry. Eliza sat with her back against a wall, her knees drawn up to her chest, and stared at nothing. Thomas could see her trembling, delayed shock maybe, or just exhaustion catching up. "They knew we were coming," she said finally, her voice hollow. "Rourke knew." "Maybe. Or maybe they've just been watching every road into Sacramento waiting for you to show up." Thomas sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Either way, it doesn't change what we have to do." "Yes, it does. It means walking into the city is suicide. They'll be watching every entry point, every street that leads to Mrs. Chen's boarding house. We'll never make it." "Then we don't walk in the front door," Thomas said. "We find another way. Sneak in after dark, stay in the shadows, move fast. You know the city better than they think you do. Use that." Eliza turned to look at him, and in the dim light filtering through the barn's gaps, he could see the fear in her eyes, not just of dying, but of failing, of coming so close and losing everything. "What if the evidence isn't there?" she whispered. "What if Rourke already found it?" "Then we'll find another way to prove your innocence. But we won't know until we look." She closed her eyes, and a single tear slid down her cheek. Thomas reached out hesitantly and wiped it away with his thumb. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know, so am I. But we're still here and we're still fighting. That counts for something." Eliza opened her eyes and looked at him. Really looked at him, seeing past the rough exterior and the careful distance he usually kept. "Why are you doing this, Thomas? And don't tell me it's because it's the right thing to do. There has to be more than that." Thomas was quiet for a long time, searching for words that felt true. "I spent 3 years of my life watching people die for reasons that didn't matter. Politics and pride and men playing games with other people's lives. And when it was over, I swore I'd never be part of that again. Never stand by and do nothing while someone suffered because it was easier than getting involved." He paused. "You were dying in that desert because powerful men decided you were inconvenient. And I won't let that stand. Not while I can still do something about it. Even if it costs you everything? Even then." Eliza stared at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. The fear didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else. Determination, maybe. Or hope. "All right," she said softly. "Then let's finish this." They slept in shifts again that night, and when dawn came, they were already moving. Sacramento rose ahead of them like a promise and a threat, its buildings visible on the horizon, smoke from 1,000 chimneys smudging the sky. Thomas led them to the outskirts and stopped, studying the city from a distance. It sprawled along the river, warehouses and docks on the waterfront, fine houses on the hills beyond, and in between the tangled streets where most people lived and worked. Mrs. Chen's boarding house, Eliza said, pointing, 3 blocks in from the river, near the Chinese quarter. If we come in from the east, through the alleys behind the laundries, we can avoid the main streets. And Rourke's men? They'll be concentrated around the nicer parts of town. That's where Rourke has his office, where the bank is. They might have someone watching the boarding house, but they can't cover every building in the city. It was thin reasoning, but it was all they had. Thomas nodded. Then that's what we'll do. We go in after dark, get the evidence, and get out. Fast and quiet. They spent the day hidden in a grove of eucalyptus trees, resting and waiting for night to fall. Eliza cleaned and checked the revolver Thomas had given her, her movements careful and precise, while Thomas sharpened his knife and mentally rehearsed the plan. When the sun finally set and the city lights began to flicker on one by one, they mounted up and rode toward Sacramento. The outskirts were quiet, just a few workers heading home late, a drunk stumbling out of a saloon, a woman hanging laundry in the fading light. No one paid them any attention as they slipped into the maze of alleys that ran behind the main streets. Eliza guided them with quiet confidence, navigating the narrow passages like she'd walked them 1,000 times. They passed the backs of shops and homes, smelling cooking fires and hearing fragments of conversation in a dozen different languages. Finally, Eliza raised a hand and they stopped. There, she whispered, pointing to a narrow 3-story building with peeling paint and a crooked sign that read Chen's boarding house in faded letters. Thomas scanned the street. No obvious watchers, no suspicious figures loitering in doorways, but that didn't mean they weren't there. I'll go in alone, Eliza said. If someone's watching, they're looking for a woman. If they see me with you, they'll know I have help. Absolutely not. We go in together or not at all? Thomas? No arguments. We're exposed out here, and I'm not letting you walk into a trap by yourself. He dismounted and tied his horse to a post. Come on, let's get this done. Eliza hesitated, then nodded and followed him to the boarding house's back entrance. The door was unlocked, and they slipped inside into a dim hallway that smelled of cabbage and lye soap. The boarding house was quiet, most of the residents already asleep or out for the evening. Eliza led Thomas to a narrow staircase that descended into darkness, and at the bottom they found themselves in a cellar crowded with storage. Crates, barrels, old furniture covered in dust. Over here, Eliza whispered, moving to the far corner where the stairs met the wall. She knelt and ran her fingers along the baseboard until she found what she was looking for, a loose board that came away with a soft creak. Behind it was a hollow space, and inside the hollow was a leather portfolio tied with string. Eliza pulled it out with shaking hands, untied the string, and opened it. Inside were dozens of pages covered in neat handwriting, copies of ledgers, transaction records, names and dates and amounts that told a story of systematic theft. It's here, she breathed. It's all here. Thomas felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly buckled his knees. Then A board creaked above them. They both froze, looking up at the ceiling. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the floor overhead. Then a voice, cold and cultured, drifted down through the floorboards. I was wondering when you'd show up, Miss Caldwell. Eliza's face went white. Rourke, she whispered. The footsteps moved toward the staircase, and Thomas heard the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. You've led me on quite a chase, Gideon Rourke continued, his voice growing louder as he descended the stairs. But I'm afraid this is where it ends. You have something that belongs to me, and I intend to take it back. Along with your life, of course. Can't have witnesses. Thomas grabbed Eliza's arm and pulled her behind a stack of crates, pressing a finger to his lips. His mind raced, searching for options. They were trapped, one exit, and Rourke between them and freedom. Rourke reached the bottom of the stairs, and Thomas caught a glimpse of him through a gap in the crates. Tall, well-dressed, with dark hair going gray at the temples and eyes like chips of ice. He held a pistol loosely in one hand, supremely confident. I know you're down here, Rourke said pleasantly, and I know you're not alone. The man who helped you escape my people in the desert, perhaps? How touching. But it won't save you. Thomas met Eliza's eyes and saw his own desperation reflected there. Then he made a decision. He stood up, stepping out from behind the crates with his hands raised and his rifle left behind. "Looking for me?" he said. Rourke turned, his pistol swinging around to point at Thomas's chest. A smile ghosted across his face, cold and utterly without humor. "There you are. And where, might I ask, is Miss Caldwell?" "Gone," Thomas lied. "Ran out the back while you were making your speech." "You're too late." Rourke's eyes narrowed. "I don't believe you." "Believe what you want. She's not here." For a long moment they stood frozen, two men sizing each other up across 10 feet of dusty cellar. Then Rourke's smile widened. "No matter, I'll find her, and when I do, she'll die just like Marcus Holcomb died, quickly and without anyone caring." He raised the pistol, aiming between Thomas's eyes. "But first I think I'll deal with you. Can't have heroes running around ruining my—" The shot came from behind the crates, loud as thunder in the confined space. Rourke's pistol flew from his hand, struck by Eliza's bullet, and he stumbled back with a cry of pain and shock. Thomas didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, crashing into Rourke and driving him against the wall. They grappled, Rourke stronger than his refined appearance suggested, and Thomas felt a fist connect with his jaw hard enough to make his vision blur. But Thomas had spent years fighting for his life, and Rourke was just a man used to other people doing his violence for him. Thomas drove his knee into Rourke's stomach, and when the man doubled over, Thomas brought his elbow down on the back of Rourke's neck. Rourke collapsed, gasping for air, and Thomas grabbed him by the collar and hauled him upright. "Eliza," Thomas shouted, "get the portfolio and run!" But Eliza was already moving, the leather case clutched to her chest and the revolver still in her hand. She ran for the stairs and stopped cold. Two more men stood at the top, silhouetted against the light from the hallway above. The scarred man from the river and another Thomas didn't recognize. "Going somewhere?" the scarred man asked, descending slowly. They were trapped. Rourke behind them, his men ahead, and no way out. Thomas felt Rourke start to laugh beneath his hands, a low, triumphant sound that made Thomas's blood run cold. "I told you this is where it ends," Rourke rasped. "You should have listened." Thomas's grip tightened on Rourke's collar as the two men descended the stairs, their boots heavy on the worn wood. The scarred man's eyes gleamed with something darker than mere duty. This was personal for him, Thomas realized. This was the man who'd beaten Eliza and left her to die, and now he had a chance to finish what he'd started. "Let him go," the scarred man said, his voice like gravel scraping stone. "Step away from Mr. Rourke, and maybe we'll make this quick." Thomas didn't move. His mind was racing, cataloging everything in the cellar that could be used as a weapon or an escape route. The crates behind them were too heavy to move quickly. The small window near the ceiling was barred with iron. The only exit was the staircase, and Rourke's men blocked it completely. Eliza stood frozen halfway between Thomas and the stairs, the portfolio pressed against her chest like armor, and the revolver trembling in her other hand. Her eyes met Thomas's, and in that split second they had an entire conversation without words. She was asking him what to do, asking if this was the end. Thomas gave the smallest shake of his head. Not yet. Not while they were still breathing. "You want him?" Thomas called out, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. "Come take him." He shoved Rourke forward violently, sending the man stumbling toward his own hired guns. Rourke crashed into the scarred man, and in the chaos of tangled limbs and cursing, Thomas grabbed Eliza's arm and yanked her behind the stack of crates. "The window," he hissed, pointing to the barred opening near the ceiling. "Can you fit through those bars?" "They're iron. Can you fit?" Eliza looked, her face pale but determined. "Maybe. If I—" A gunshot exploded through the cellar, the bullet punching through the crate inches from Thomas's head and showering them with splinters. Thomas grabbed his rifle from where he'd left it and returned fire blindly, not aiming to hit, but to buy them seconds. "Go!" he shouted at Eliza. "Now!" She scrambled up onto a barrel and reached for the window bars, testing them with desperate hands. They were old, set in crumbling mortar, and when she pulled hard, one of them shifted slightly in its socket. Another shot. This one from a different angle. Thomas fired back and heard someone curse, which meant he'd gotten close. The cellar was filling with gun smoke, thick and acrid, making it hard to see more than shadows and movement. "Thomas!" Eliza's voice was strained with effort. "I can't. The bars won't. Thomas left his cover and vaulted up beside her, adding his strength to hers. Together they pulled on the loose bar and the old mortar cracked and crumbled. The bar came free with a shriek of protesting metal, leaving a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "You first," Thomas said, lacing his fingers together to give her a boost. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you. Go!" Eliza hesitated for only a heartbeat, then stepped into his cupped hands and let him lift her toward the window. She grabbed the remaining bars and pulled herself up with a strength Thomas hadn't known she possessed, her body squeezing through the narrow gap with the portfolio still clutched against her ribs. For a terrible second she stuck, her shoulders too wide, and Thomas thought they were finished. But then she twisted, exhaling completely, and slithered through like water through a sieve. She disappeared into the darkness beyond, and Thomas heard her hit the ground outside with a muffled grunt. A hand grabbed Thomas's shoulder and spun him around. The scarred man, his face twisted with rage, drove a fist into Thomas's stomach hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. Thomas doubled over, gasping, and the man followed up with a knee aimed at his face. Thomas managed to catch the knee and twist, sending the scarred man stumbling backward into the second hired gun. They went down in a tangle, and Thomas didn't wait to see them recover. He grabbed the edge of the window and pulled himself up, his shoulders screaming in protest as he forced his body through the gap. Something caught his boot, a hand, grabbing tight, and Thomas kicked back hard. He felt his heel connect with flesh and bone, heard a satisfying crack, and the grip released. He wriggled the rest of the way through the window and dropped into the alley beyond, landing in a crouch next to where Eliza was waiting. "Run!" he gasped, and they ran. Behind them, Rourke's voice echoed up from the cellar, high and furious. "After them! Don't let them escape!" Thomas and Eliza sprinted through the alley, their boots splashing through puddles of dubious origin, the sounds of pursuit already rising behind them. The narrow passage twisted and turned, opening onto a wider street crowded with evening traffic, workers heading home, merchants closing their shops, children playing in the fading light. "This way!" Eliza panted, ducking left into another alley. Thomas followed, trusting her knowledge of the city's veins and arteries. They ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the boarding house. Finally, Eliza stumbled to a halt in a narrow court between two warehouses, pressing her hand against her side where her ribs were clearly protesting the abuse. Thomas scanned the shadows, listening for footsteps, for shouts, for any sign they'd been followed. The city noise surrounded them, distant laughter, the clatter of a wagon, someone singing off-key, but nothing close, nothing immediate. "We need to get off the streets," he said quietly. "Rourke will have men searching everywhere now that he knows we have the evidence." Eliza nodded, still catching her breath. "There's a place. Ada's cousin, Mara Winslow. She runs a small clinic near the Chinese Quarter. If we can reach her, can you find it from here?" "I think so. It's not far, maybe 10 blocks north." Eliza straightened, wincing but determined. "But Thomas, even if we reach her, then what? We have the evidence, but who can we give it to? Rourke has the police in his pocket, probably the city marshal too. Anyone official we approach will just hand us over to him." Thomas pulled the portfolio from where Eliza still clutched it and opened it, scanning the pages inside. Neat columns of numbers, names, dates, all of it damning if anyone bothered to look. But Eliza was right. In a city where Rourke's money bought cooperation and silence, simply having proof wasn't enough. "Ada said her cousin knows people," Thomas said slowly. "People with influence. Maybe she knows someone honest, someone who can't be bought." "That's a lot of maybes. You have a better idea?" Eliza shook her head, and Thomas saw the exhaustion creeping into her features. Not just physical, but emotional. She'd been running for so long, fighting for so long, and now that they actually had what they'd come for, the enormity of what still lay ahead was settling on her shoulders like a physical weight. Thomas reached out and squeezed her hand briefly. "One step at a time. First we find Mara Winslow. Then we figure out the rest." Eliza's fingers tightened around his for just a moment before she let go. "All right, follow me." She led them through Sacramento's back streets with the careful navigation of someone who'd once called this city home. They avoided the main thoroughfares where gaslights illuminated everything and everyone, instead keeping to the darker lanes where people minded their own business and strangers were invisible. Twice they had to hide. Once when a group of rough-looking men passed too close, their voices loud with drink and violence. And once when Thomas spotted what might have been one of Rourke's hired guns checking faces on a street corner. But they made it through undetected, and finally, Eliza stopped in front of a narrow building wedged between a laundry and a herb shop. A small wooden sign hung above the door. Winslow Clinic. All welcome. "This is it," Eliza whispered. Thomas tried the door and found it unlocked. They slipped inside into a small waiting room lit by a single oil lamp. The space was clean but worn, with mismatched chairs lined against one wall and shelves holding neat rows of bottles and medical supplies. A faint smell of carbolic and herbs hung in the air. A woman appeared in the doorway to the back room, maybe 40, with dark hair pinned severely back and sharp eyes that took in every detail of her unexpected visitors. She wore a simple dress with the sleeves rolled up and an apron marked with old stains that might have been blood. "We're closed," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Come back in the morning if you need—" She stopped, her eyes widening as she got a better look at Eliza's face. Recognition flickered across her features, followed quickly by alarm. "You're her," she said flatly. "The woman from the wanted posters, the one who killed the banker." Thomas stepped between them instinctively, his hand moving toward the knife at his belt. "We're not here to cause trouble." "Then why are you here at all? Do you know what happens if someone finds out I'm harboring a fugitive?" But even as she spoke, Mara Winslow was moving forward, her professional instincts overriding her caution. She took Eliza's chin gently and turned her head to examine the fading bruises, the still healing cut along her hairline. "Who did this to you?" "The same men who are trying to kill me now," Eliza said quietly. "Miss Winslow." "Mrs. Winslow, but call me Mara." She released Eliza and stepped back, crossing her arms. "I assume you're not here for medical attention." "Ada Holloway sent us," Thomas said. "She said you might be able to help." Something shifted in Mara's expression at Ada's name. Surprise, followed by a complicated mix of emotions Thomas couldn't quite read. "Ada sent you? How is the old dragon?" "Alive and ornery as ever," Thomas replied, and despite everything, he found himself almost smiling. "She gave us a letter of introduction, but we lost it when, well, it's been a complicated few days." Mara studied them both for a long moment, her gaze moving from Thomas's battered face to the portfolio Eliza still held to the desperate hope barely concealed in both their expressions. Finally, she sighed and moved to lock the clinic's front door, pulling down a shade over the window. "Come into the back," she said, "and you'd better tell me everything." They followed her into a small examination room that also served as her personal space. A narrow bed in one corner, a table and chairs, a stove where a kettle was just beginning to steam. Mara poured 3 cups of tea with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times and gestured for them to sit. Thomas remained standing, too wired to relax, but Eliza sank into a chair gratefully. She set the portfolio on the table and began to talk. She told Mara everything: the embezzlement she'd discovered, Marcus Holcomb's murder, the frame-up, the beating in the desert, Thomas finding her on the trail. She spoke in a flat, exhausted voice that somehow made the horror of it all more vivid. And when she was done, she opened the portfolio and spread the evidence across the table like a challenge. Mara examined the documents in silence, her expression growing darker with each page. When she finished, she sat back and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. "Gideon Rourke," she said finally. "I've heard the name. Everyone has. He's got connections everywhere. The mayor's office, the police, half the merchants in the city. If he wants you dead, there aren't many places you can hide." "We're not interested in hiding anymore," Thomas said. "We need someone who can use this evidence, someone Rourke doesn't own." "That's a very short list," Mara said dryly, "but there might be one person. A newspaper man named Caleb Winslow, my brother. He runs a small paper that prints actual news instead of whatever the advertisers pay him to say. He's been trying to expose corruption in the city for years, but he's never had proof solid enough to print without getting sued into oblivion." She tapped the documents. "This would change that." Hope flared in Eliza's eyes. "Would he help us?" "Help you? He'd probably kiss you. But getting these documents to him is the problem. Caleb's office is on the other side of the city, in a building Rourke's men will definitely be watching once word gets out that you escaped. Mara paused, thinking. We'd need a distraction, something to draw their attention away long enough for you to slip through. What kind of distraction? Thomas asked. Mara smiled, and there was something fierce in it. The kind that involves a lot of chaos and very poor decision-making. But first, you two need rest. You look like you're about to collapse, and we can't do anything until morning anyway. Caleb doesn't open his office until 8. We don't have time to rest, Eliza protested. Every hour we wait is an hour you use to heal and plan instead of stumbling around making mistakes that get you killed, Mara interrupted. Trust me, I've seen enough people push themselves past their limits to know where that road leads. Sleep now, fight later. Thomas saw the wisdom in it, even as his instincts screamed to keep moving. But Mara was right. They were both running on fumes and adrenaline, and sooner or later that would run out at exactly the wrong moment. 4 hours, he said. We rest for 4 hours, and then we move whether we're ready or not. Mara nodded. Fair enough. You can use my bed, both of you. I'll keep watch and wake you when it's time. Eliza started to protest, but Thomas was already guiding her toward the bed. She was asleep almost before her head hit the pillow, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion it had been fighting for days. Thomas sat in the chair beside the bed, intending to keep watch despite Mara's offer. But his own fatigue caught up with him. The last thing he remembered was Mara draping a blanket over his shoulders and the sound of her moving quietly around the room, preparing for whatever came next. He woke to Mara shaking his shoulder gently. It's time, and we have a problem. Thomas was instantly alert, his hand going to his knife before his eyes were fully open. What kind of problem? The kind with wanted posters. Mara handed him a piece of paper, freshly printed and still smelling of ink. Thomas looked at it and felt his stomach drop. It was a poster offering $1,000 for information leading to Eliza's capture. But there was a second poster attached beneath it. This one showed a crude but recognizable sketch of Thomas himself, offering $500 for the man aiding and abetting the fugitive Eliza Caldwell. How did they? Someone at the boarding house must have seen you, Mara said grimly, or Rourke got a description from his men. Either way, half the city is going to be looking for both of you by noon. We need to move now. Eliza was already awake, studying the posters with an expression that was equal parts fear and fury. We should split up. If they're looking for a man and a woman together. No, Thomas and Mara said simultaneously. You're stronger together, Mara continued. And besides, my brother's office is in a part of town where strangers stand out. You'll need each other to blend in as a couple, maybe workers going to the docks or immigrants looking for housing. Separately, you're suspicious. Together, you're invisible. It made sense, even though Thomas hated the risk. What about this distraction you mentioned? Mara's smile was all teeth. Already arranged. I sent word to some friends, people who owe me favors, people who have their own reasons to dislike Gideon Rourke. At 9 o'clock this morning, there's going to be a fire in a warehouse on the south side of town. Nothing dangerous, just enough smoke and confusion to pull the police and Rourke's hired guns in that direction. While they're dealing with that, you'll approach Caleb's office from the north. You set a building on fire for us? Eliza asked, somewhere between horrified and awed. An empty building scheduled for demolition anyway, Mara clarified. And it's not for you. It's because I'm tired of men like Rourke turning this city into their personal kingdom while good people suffer. Your evidence gives us a chance to change that. I'm not about to let it slip through our fingers. She pulled out a rough map of the city and spread it on the table, marking their route with quick strokes. You'll go through the textile district here, cut across the rail yard, and come up behind Caleb's building through the alley. I'll go ahead and warn him you're coming. Once you hand over the documents, he'll need a few hours to duplicate everything and write the story. After that, we need to make sure the story actually gets printed and distributed before Rourke can stop it, Thomas finished. How do we do that? Caleb has contacts at 3 other papers in the city. If he can get the story to all of them simultaneously, Rourke can't suppress it without making himself look even more guilty. But getting those copies delivered safely is going to be the dangerous part. Everything about this is dangerous, Eliza said quietly. But we've come too far to stop now. Mara looked at her with something like respect. Ada said you were brave. She didn't mention you were stubborn, too. Runs in the family, Eliza replied, and there was the ghost of a smile on her lips. They prepared quickly and efficiently. Mara gave them workers' clothes to replace their dusty, torn outfits, a rough cotton dress for Eliza, and a laborer's shirt and trousers for Thomas. She packed the portfolio into a canvas bag that looked like it might contain tools or lunch, and she gave Thomas a cap to pull low over his eyes. Keep your heads down, don't make eye contact, and for the love of everything holy, don't run unless you absolutely have to, she instructed. Running makes you memorable. Walk like you belong there, and people will see what they expect to see. At 8:30, Mara opened the clinic's back door and checked the alley beyond. Clear. She handed Thomas the bag with the portfolio and clasped Eliza's hands briefly. Be careful, she said, and tell my brother that if he doesn't use this evidence to bury Rourke, I'll make his life miserable. Thank you, Eliza whispered, for everything. Mara waved that away. Thank me when this is over and you're both still alive. Now go. They slipped into the alley and began walking, Thomas's hand resting lightly on Eliza's back in a gesture that looked protective but also kept them connected in the crowd. The morning streets were already filling with people, workers heading to the mills and factories, vendors setting up stalls, children running errands before school. Thomas and Eliza moved through it all like ghosts, just another couple in a city full of thousands. They crossed the textile district where the air was thick with lint and the clatter of looms, navigated the rail yard where men were already loading freight cars with timber and grain, and finally entered the warren of narrow streets that led to the newspaper district. As they approached Caleb Winslow's building, a narrow 3-story structure that leaned slightly to one side, Thomas noticed the man standing across the street. He was trying to look casual, leaning against a lamppost and smoking a cigarette, but his eyes were constantly moving, watching everyone who approached the building. One of Rourke's men. Thomas squeezed Eliza's arm in warning and steered her past the building without stopping, turning down a side street as if they'd always intended to go that way. Once they were around the corner, he pulled her into a doorway. They're watching the front, he said quietly. We'll have to find another way in. The alley, Eliza said. Mara said to come in through the alley. They circled around, moving carefully, and found the alley that ran behind the row of buildings. It was narrow and dark, piled with crates and refuse, but it was empty. Thomas counted buildings until he found the one that should be Caleb's office and tried the back door. Locked. He was about to try forcing it when the door opened from the inside. A man stood there, middle-aged, ink-stained, with spectacles perched on his nose and the intense, slightly manic look of someone who survived on coffee and deadlines. Mara sent word you were coming, Caleb Winslow said without preamble. Get inside before someone sees you. They hurried into the building, and Caleb locked the door behind them. The space was cluttered with papers, printing equipment, and the sharp smell of ink and machine oil. A young man, barely more than a boy, was working one of the presses, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. That's my assistant, James, Caleb said, gesturing dismissively. He knows to keep his mouth shut. Now show me what you've got. Thomas handed over the portfolio, and Caleb spread the documents across a work table already littered with half-finished articles. His eyes moved rapidly over the pages, and Thomas could actually see the moment the implications hit him. His expression shifted from professional interest to barely contained excitement. This is extraordinary, Caleb breathed. Do you understand what this proves? Not just embezzlement, but a systematic looting of the bank's assets. Fake accounts, forged signatures, transfers to shell companies. This goes back years. Tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more. And these names, he tapped a page. Some of these people are prominent citizens. Rourke couldn't have done this alone. He had help. Can you print it? Eliza asked urgently. Can you get the story out before Rourke stops you? I can do better than that. Caleb's smile was fierce and slightly unhinged. I can make this the biggest story Sacramento has seen in a decade. But I need time. A few hours to duplicate these documents, write the article, and get copies to the other papers. Can you keep Rourke off my back that long? Thomas and Eliza exchanged a glance. We'll try, Thomas said. But if his men realize we're here, Then you run, and I'll deal with them, Caleb interrupted. This story is bigger than any of us. It's about justice, accountability, the very soul of this city. I won't let it die because of threats and violence. A loud crash came from the front of the building, the sound of glass breaking. Everyone froze. Stay here, Caleb hissed, moving toward the front room. Thomas ignored him and followed, hand on his knife. The front window was shattered, and through the jagged opening, Thomas could see 4 men outside, the watcher from across the street and 3 others, all armed. One of them was the scarred man from the boarding house, his face still bruised from where Thomas had kicked him. Winslow, the scarred man shouted. We know they're in there. Send them out, or we're coming in. Caleb stood in the doorway between the front office and the printing room, his body blocking the view of Thomas and Eliza. This is private property. You're trespassing. And you're harboring criminals. The woman's wanted for murder, and the man's wanted for aiding her. Hand them over, and we'll leave you alone. I don't know what you're talking about, Caleb said calmly. There's no one here but me and my assistant. The scarred man smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. Then you won't mind if we come in and look around. He stepped toward the door, and Thomas saw his hand move toward his gun. Time seemed to slow, and Thomas realized they were out of options. If Rourke's men came in, it would end in violence. If they surrendered, it would end in death. The only choice left was the desperate one. Thomas grabbed the portfolio from the work table, shoved it into Caleb's hands, and pushed him back toward the printing press. Print it, Thomas said urgently. Print everything. James, help him. What are you going to do? Caleb demanded. Buy you time, Thomas replied. He turned to Eliza. There's a back door. We run, we lead them away, and we don't stop until Caleb's story is in every paper in the city. Thomas, no arguments. This was always going to end with a chase. Might as well make it count. Outside, the scarred man was trying the door. Finding it locked, he raised his boot to kick it in. Thomas grabbed Eliza's hand and ran for the back of the building. They burst through the rear door into the alley, just as the front door splintered open behind them. Shouts erupted, and Thomas heard boots pounding through the building in pursuit. They sprinted down the alley, Eliza's hand tight in his, her breathing already labored but her pace never faltering. Behind them, the scarred man and his companions emerged into the alley and gave chase. There! The scarred man roared. Don't let them escape! A gunshot cracked through the morning air, and the bullet struck brick inches from Thomas's head. He pulled Eliza around a corner through a narrow gap between buildings, and they emerged onto a crowded street. People screamed and scattered at the sight of armed men running through their midst. Thomas and Eliza pushed through the chaos, using the crowd as cover, but Rourke's men were relentless. They ran through the market district where vendors cursed and dove out of their way, past a church where the bell was tolling 9 o'clock, through a park where children played and lovers walked. Every step took them farther from Caleb's office, farther from the evidence that could save them, but also farther from the men who would kill them. Thomas's lungs burned and his legs felt like lead, but he kept running. Beside him, Eliza was gasping for air, her face white with pain from her still healing ribs, but she didn't slow down. Behind them, the pursuit continued, 4 men with guns and murder in their eyes, closing the distance step by step. And somewhere across the city, in a small printing office with a broken window, Caleb Winslow was setting type and preparing to expose the truth. Thomas just had to keep them alive long enough for it to matter. They burst through the door of a livery stable, startling the horses and sending a young stable hand scrambling out of their path. Thomas dragged Eliza behind a stack of hay bales just as Rourke's men appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning light. I saw them come in here, one of them said, breathing hard. Search every stall. Thomas pressed his finger to his lips, and Eliza nodded, her chest heaving silently as she fought to catch her breath. They could hear the men spreading out, boots scuffing on straw, the creak of stall doors being yanked open. The scarred man's voice cut through the stable like a blade. You're only making this harder on yourselves. Come out now and I'll make it quick. Keep running and I'll make you beg for death before I'm done. Thomas felt Eliza shudder beside him, and he squeezed her hand once, a silent promise that he wouldn't let that happen. His mind raced through options. They were trapped in a building with 1 exit and 4 armed men between them and freedom. Fighting their way out would be suicide, but waiting to be found was just dying slowly. Then he saw it, a ladder leading up to the hayloft, and beyond that, a small loading door that opened onto the street behind the stable. It was a gamble, but it was the only chance they had. Thomas pointed up, and Eliza's eyes followed. She hesitated for only a second before nodding. They moved together, quick and silent, climbing the ladder while the searchers were still occupied with the ground floor. The ancient wood creaked under their weight, and Thomas's heart hammered in his ears, certain that any moment someone would hear and look up. But they made it to the loft and crossed to the loading door. Thomas eased it open and looked out. A 10-foot drop to a pile of old hay in the alley below. Not ideal, but survivable. "Can you make it?" he whispered. "Do I have a choice?" Eliza replied, and there was something almost like humor in her exhausted voice. Below them, the scarred man shouted, "Check the loft!" Thomas didn't wait. He grabbed Eliza and they jumped together, hitting the hay pile hard enough to knock the wind from both of them. Thomas rolled to his feet, pulling Eliza up, and they ran again. The streets were a blur of faces and buildings, the shouts of pursuit fading and then growing loud again as Rourke's men emerged from the stable and spotted them. Thomas led Eliza through a maze of alleys, across a busy intersection where a freight wagon nearly ran them down, and finally into the relative sanctuary of the telegraph office district. He pulled her into a narrow space between two buildings, both of them gasping for air, and risked a glance back the way they'd come. No sign of their pursuers yet, but Thomas knew it wouldn't last. The scarred man was relentless, and he knew this city as well as they did. "We can't keep running forever," Eliza panted, leaning heavily against the wall. "They'll catch us eventually." "Then we don't run," Thomas said, his mind working through a desperate plan. "We find a place to make a stand, somewhere public enough that they can't just shoot us down in the street." "Where?" "Every building in this city is either owned by someone in Rourke's pocket or too afraid to help us." Thomas thought of the wanted posters, of the $1,000 reward on Eliza's head and the $500 on his own. He thought of Caleb Winslow racing against time to print the truth, and of Mara's staged fire meant to distract the authorities, and he realized what they needed was the exact opposite of hiding. "The telegraph office," he said. "The main one on K Street. It's always crowded, always has witnesses. If we can get inside, we can send word to the state marshal in San Francisco, tell him what's happening, that we have evidence of massive fraud and corruption. Even if Rourke owns the local law, he doesn't own everyone." Eliza stared at him. "That's insane. The telegraph office will be one of the first places they look for us." "Exactly. Which is why they won't expect us to actually be there. And by the time they figure it out, our message will already be sent and recorded in their logs. Even if Rourke tries to suppress it, there'll be a paper trail." It was a thin plan, full of holes and desperate hope, but Eliza's expression shifted from doubt to determination. "All right," she said, "let's do it." They emerged from the alley and walked toward K Street, forcing themselves to move calmly despite every instinct screaming to run. Thomas kept his cap pulled low and his eyes down, and Eliza stayed close to his side, playing the part of a worker's wife running errands with her husband. The telegraph office was a substantial brick building with large windows that let passers-by see the orderly rows of clerks working their instruments. Thomas pushed through the door, and they joined the small crowd of people waiting to send messages. A harried clerk looked up from his desk. "Name and destination?" "Thomas Brennan," Thomas said, keeping his voice steady. "Message to State Marshal William Crawford in San Francisco. It's urgent." The clerk pulled out a form and dipped his pen in ink. "Go ahead." Thomas spoke slowly and clearly, making sure every word was recorded. "Marshal Crawford. Evidence of massive bank fraud and murder in Sacramento. Gideon Rourke of Rourke and Associates responsible for embezzlement of over $50,000 and murder of Marcus Holcomb. Witness Eliza Caldwell falsely accused to cover crime. Documentation in possession of Caleb Winslow, Sacramento Citizen newspaper. Request immediate investigation. Lives in danger." The clerk's pen had slowed as he wrote, his eyes widening with each sentence. When Thomas finished, the man looked up with an expression caught between shock and fear. "Sir, if this is some kind of joke—" "It's not a joke," Eliza said, stepping forward. "I'm Eliza Caldwell, and if you check your wanted posters, you'll see my face. But before you call the police, you should know that everything in that message is true, and the proof is being printed right now for tomorrow's papers." The clerk stared at her, then at Thomas, then at the message he'd just written. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the telegraph key. "I'll send it," he said quietly, "but I can't protect you when the authorities arrive." "We're not asking you to," Thomas replied. "Just send the message. The rest is up to us." The clerk bent to his work, his fingers dancing over the telegraph key with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd done this thousands of times. The clicking filled the office, and other people in line began to notice something was wrong. Whispers started, heads turning, someone pointing at Eliza, and then at a wanted poster tacked to the wall. "That's her," a man said loudly. "That's the woman who killed the banker." The office erupted into chaos. Some people backed away in fear, others pressed forward to get a better look, and one enterprising soul ran out the door, probably to fetch the police or collect the reward himself. Thomas positioned himself between Eliza and the crowd, his hand on his knife. "We're not looking for trouble. Just let us be." "She's a murderer," someone shouted. "She's innocent," Thomas shot back. "And the real killer is Gideon Rourke. If you want justice, you'll wait for the truth to come out instead of believing everything you read on a poster." The crowd murmured, uncertain. These were working people, immigrants and laborers who had their own reasons to distrust the powerful and wealthy. But they were also people who needed that reward money, who had families to feed and debts to pay. The clerk finished sending the message and looked up. "It's done. Sent and confirmed received in San Francisco." Relief flooded through Thomas. Whatever happened now, the truth was out there. Crawford would receive the message, would investigate, and even if Rourke managed to kill them both, the evidence would remain. Then the door burst open and Gideon Rourke himself strode in, flanked by the scarred man and two others. His expensive suit was disheveled, his carefully groomed hair coming loose, and there was a wild fury in his eyes that made him look more animal than human. "There they are," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a whip. "Seize them. They're wanted criminals." The scarred man drew his pistol, and the crowd scattered, people diving for cover behind desks and filing cabinets. Thomas pulled Eliza down just as the gun went off, the bullet punching through the window behind them and showering them with glass. "Stop!" the telegraph clerk shouted, his voice cracking. "This is a federal office. You can't—" Rourke turned on him with such venom that the clerk fell silent. "These two are murderers and thieves. I have every right to see them brought to justice. Now stand aside." But before anyone could move, another voice cut through the chaos, strong, authoritative, and utterly unexpected. "The only person who's going to be brought to justice is you, Rourke." Everyone turned. Standing in the doorway was a tall man in a marshal's uniform, his badge gleaming on his chest and a rifle held casually in his hands. Behind him stood 3 deputies, all armed, all watching the room with the calm alertness of men who knew their business. Rourke's face went pale. "Marshal Hayes, this is city business. It doesn't concern the state marshal's office." "That's where you're wrong," Hayes replied, stepping into the office. His eyes flicked to Thomas and Eliza, taking in their battered condition, then to the telegram still sitting on the clerk's desk. "I received a very interesting message about an hour ago from a newspaper editor named Caleb Winslow. He sent copies of some rather damning financial documents to several law enforcement offices, including mine. Documents that suggest you've been running a criminal enterprise out of the First Sacramento Bank for the better part of 5 years. "Those documents are forgeries," Rourke said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Fabricated by this woman to cover her own crimes." "That's a claim you'll have the chance to make in court," Hayes said, "along with explanations for why your handwriting appears on dozens of fraudulent transactions, why money was transferred to companies you secretly own, and why Marcus Holcomb was killed the same night Miss Caldwell discovered the embezzlement scheme." He nodded to his deputies. "Take him." The scarred man raised his pistol, aiming at the marshal, but he was too slow. Hayes's rifle came up in one smooth motion and fired, the bullet striking the scarred man's hand and sending his weapon clattering to the floor. The man howled in pain and dropped to his knees. The other hired guns looked at each other, at the marshal and his deputies, and slowly raised their hands in surrender. They were thugs, not martyrs, and they knew when a fight was lost. Rourke stood frozen as one of the deputies approached with handcuffs. For a moment, Thomas thought he might try to run, might pull a hidden weapon and go down fighting. But then the fight drained out of him all at once, leaving only a hollow shell of the man who'd been so certain of his power just moments before. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Rourke said as the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. I have friends, connections. This won't stick. Maybe, Hayes said calmly. But I've got 3 newspaper editors who are printing the full story even as we speak, complete with copies of your fraudulent records. I've got a telegraph from the state marshal himself ordering a full investigation. And I've got dozens of witnesses who've seen your men attempt murder in a federal office. So you go ahead and call your friends. See if they're still willing to help you when the whole state is reading about your crimes over breakfast. Rourke's face twisted with impotent rage, but he said nothing more as the deputies led him out. The scarred man and the other hired guns followed, all of them cuffed and silent. Marshal Hayes turned to Thomas and Eliza, his expression softening slightly. You two all right? Thomas nodded, not quite trusting his voice. Eliza was trembling beside him, her hand gripping his so tightly it hurt, but she was upright and whole and alive. We're fine, Thomas managed. Thank you, Marshal. Hayes waved that away. Thank Caleb Winslow. He's the one who made sure copies of those documents reached every law office within 50 miles before Rourke could interfere. Smart man. Paranoid but smart. He paused. Miss Caldwell, you'll need to make a formal statement about everything that happened. It'll help when we bring charges against Rourke and his associates. Of course, Eliza said, her voice barely above a whisper. Whatever you need. Good. My office is 3 blocks from here. Come along when you're ready. Hayes tipped his hat and followed his deputies out, leaving Thomas and Eliza standing amid the wreckage of the telegraph office, broken glass, scattered papers, and a crowd of onlookers still processing what they'd just witnessed. The telegraph clerk emerged from behind his desk, looking shaken but determined. That message you sent, he said. I made sure it was logged properly, just in case anyone tries to say it never happened. Thank you, Eliza said, and there were tears on her cheeks now, cutting clean tracks through the dust and grime. Thank you so much. The clerk nodded and turned back to his instruments, already composing himself to handle the backlog of messages that had accumulated during the chaos. Thomas guided Eliza outside into the bright morning sunshine. The city continued around them, indifferent to the drama that had just played out, vendors calling their wares, children running errands, wagons rumbling past on their way to the docks. It was strange how the world could change so completely for 2 people while everyone else just went about their business. Is it over? Eliza asked, her voice small and uncertain. Is it really over? I think so, Thomas said. Rourke's arrested, the evidence is public, and the law is finally on your side. You're safe now. Eliza turned to face him, and the look in her eyes was complicated. Relief and disbelief, and something deeper that made Thomas's heart beat faster. I wouldn't be alive without you, she said. When you found me in that desert, I'd given up. I thought I was going to die alone and forgotten, and no one would ever know the truth. But you didn't just save my life. You gave me a reason to keep fighting. Thomas felt his throat tighten. You did the fighting yourself. I just gave you a place to heal. You gave me more than that. Eliza reached up and touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. You gave me hope. You made me believe that there were still good people in the world, that not everyone was out to hurt me or use me or throw me away when I became inconvenient. Thomas caught her hand in his, holding it against his cheek. Eliza, let me finish, she interrupted softly. I know I'm a mess. I know I'm probably going to have nightmares for years about what happened. I know I don't have anything to offer you except trouble and complications. But if you'll have me, if you want me to stay, I'd like to try. To build something real, something good, with you. Thomas looked at her, this woman who'd been beaten and betrayed and left for dead, who'd survived impossible odds and never stopped fighting for what was right, who was brave and stubborn and more beautiful in that moment than anyone he'd ever seen. I'd like that too, he said quietly. More than you know. Eliza smiled and it transformed her entire face. She rose up on her toes and kissed him, soft and quick and full of promise. When they finally made their way to the marshal's office, they found Caleb Winslow waiting outside with Mara beside him. Caleb's hands were black with ink and his eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, but he was grinning like a man who'd just won the lottery. The first edition goes out in an hour, he said as soon as he saw them. Front page, full exposure of Rourke's crimes, complete with documentation. The other papers are running the story too. We coordinated it so it hits all at once. By tomorrow morning, everyone in Sacramento will know the truth. And the state marshal's already moving on the investigation, Mara added. They're auditing the bank's records, interviewing witnesses, building an ironclad case. Rourke won't be able to buy or threaten his way out of this one. Thomas felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying since the moment he'd found Eliza in the desert. It was really over. She was safe. They both were. I don't know how to thank you, Eliza said to both of them. Either of you. You risked everything to help people you barely knew. That's what family does, Mara said simply. And Ada would never forgive me if I let something happen to her people. Caleb nodded. Besides, this is the story of my career. I should be thanking you for handing it to me. They spent the next several hours in the marshal's office, giving statements and answering questions. Hayes was thorough but fair, and by the time they were done, the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon. You're free to go, Hayes said finally. The charges against you are being formally dropped, Miss Caldwell, and there will be a full investigation into how the frame-up was constructed and who else was involved. You'll need to stay available for testimony when the trial starts, but beyond that, you're no longer a fugitive. Eliza closed her eyes and let out a breath she'd been holding for weeks. Thank you, Marshal. Don't thank me. You're the one who had the courage to stand up to a powerful man and refuse to be silenced. That takes more guts than most people will ever have. Hayes stood and extended his hand. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me. They shook hands, and then Thomas and Eliza stepped out into the evening air. The city was settling into twilight, lamps being lit in windows, the smell of cooking fires drifting on the breeze. What now? Eliza asked. Thomas thought about the ranch waiting for them, about Ada probably worrying herself sick, about the life they could build together if they were brave enough to try. Now we go home, he said. They stayed in Sacramento long enough to see the newspapers hit the streets and watch the scandal consume the city like wildfire. Rourke's arrest was the talk of every saloon and parlor, his crimes dissected in editorials and on street corners. Other conspirators were arrested as the investigation widened, junior bank employees who'd helped falsify records, city officials who'd looked the other way, even a judge who'd been taking bribes to dismiss suspicious transactions. The First Sacramento Bank was placed under state supervision while auditors worked to untangle the web of fraud. And every day more victims came forward, people who'd lost their savings to Rourke's schemes, families bankrupted by his greed. The scope of it was staggering. Eliza testified 3 times, each session draining her emotionally, but also helping her reclaim her story. She spoke clearly and without fear, naming what had been done to her and refusing to let shame or intimidation silence her. And each time, Thomas sat in the back of the courtroom and watched her find her strength again. 2 weeks after Rourke's arrest, they prepared to leave. Mar and Caleb came to see them off, bringing supplies for the journey and news of the trial's progress. They're talking about charging Rourke with conspiracy to commit murder, Caleb reported. The men he hired to kill you are cooperating with the prosecution in exchange for lighter sentences. It's going to be a long trial, but the outcome isn't in doubt. Rourke's finished. And the bank? Eliza asked. They've recovered about half of what he stole. The rest is probably gone forever, spent or hidden in accounts we'll never find. But the bank is stable, and they're making restitution to the victims. Mara smiled. Including you. They've offered you a settlement for what was done to you. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to start over somewhere. Eliza looked at Thomas, and he saw the question in her eyes. Where did she want to start over? What kind of life did she want to build? I think I'd like to see the ranch, she said softly. If that's all right with you. Thomas felt his heart swell. I think Ada would like that too. And there's plenty of work if you're interested in ranching. I don't know the first thing about ranching. Neither did I when I started, but Ada's a good teacher, patient mostly. Eliza laughed, and the sound was like music. Then let's go home. They said their goodbyes to Mara and Caleb, promising to write and visit when the trial required Eliza's presence. Then they mounted their horses and rode out of Sacramento as the sun climbed into a clear blue sky. The journey back was nothing like the desperate flight that had brought them to the city. They traveled at an easy pace, stopping to camp in places Thomas knew were safe, talking late into the night about everything and nothing. Eliza told him about her childhood, about her parents, and the bookshop, and the dream she'd had before the world had shown her its cruel side. Thomas shared stories about the war, about the things he'd done and seen that still haunted him, and found that talking about it with someone who understood pain made it easier to bear. By the time they reached the ranch, Eliza had learned to read the land the way Thomas did, seeing water in the curve of a streambed, shelter in the lee of a hill, danger in the way birds scattered from trees. Ada was waiting on the porch when they rode up, her arms crossed and her expression caught between relief and exasperation. "Took you long enough," she said, but her voice was rough with emotion. "I was beginning to think I'd have to ride to Sacramento myself and drag you both back." Eliza dismounted and walked straight into Ada's arms, and the older woman held her fiercely. "You did good, girl," Ada murmured. "I'm proud of you." "I couldn't have done it without you," Eliza replied. "Or Thomas, or Mara and Caleb. I owe all of you my life." "You don't owe us anything except to live well," Ada said firmly. "Now come inside. I've got stew on the stove and you both look half-starved." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and right. Eliza threw herself into learning the ranch, working alongside Thomas to mend fences and tend livestock and prepare for the coming winter. Her hands, soft from years of indoor work, grew calloused and strong. Her body, weakened by trauma and flight, grew resilient again. And slowly, carefully, she began to heal. The nightmares came less frequently. The instinct to flinch at sudden movements faded. The constant vigilance that had kept her alive in Sacramento relaxed into something more like peace. Thomas watched her transform and felt his own scars beginning to close. For years he'd kept himself isolated, convinced that the darkness inside him was too much to share with anyone. But Eliza had seen him at his most desperate, had trusted him with her life, and hadn't turned away. She'd shown him that he was more than his past, more than the things he'd done in the war. He was a man who could still choose to do good, who could still protect and nurture and build instead of destroy. 3 months after their return, on a cold December evening when the first snow was falling outside, Thomas found Eliza in the barn checking on the horses. She was humming something soft and tuneless, completely absorbed in her work. He watched her for a moment, memorizing the way lamplight caught in her hair, the competent movements of her hands, the contentment in her expression. "Eliza," he said quietly. She turned, smiling. "Hey, everything all right?" "More than all right." Thomas came closer, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been even when facing down Rourke's guns. "I've been thinking about the future, about what we're building here." Eliza's smile softened. "I've been thinking about that too. I know it hasn't been that long. I know we've both got healing left to do. But I also know that I want you in my life. Not just for now, but for as long as you'll have me." He took a breath. "I'm asking if you'll stay, permanently, as my partner in this ranch and in everything else." Eliza's eyes filled with tears, but she was still smiling. "Are you asking me to marry you, Thomas Brennan?" "I suppose I am, though I don't have much to offer except hard work and a stubborn old housekeeper and a whole lot of open sky." "That's everything I need," Eliza said, and kissed him. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married in the spring, when the hills were green and wildflowers covered the meadows in waves of gold and purple. Ada stood as witness, along with Mara and Caleb, who made the journey from Sacramento to attend. It was a simple ceremony, held in the ranch house with a traveling minister officiating, but it was perfect. Afterward, they had a celebration that lasted into the night, music and dancing and food prepared by Ada with uncharacteristic sentimentality. Mara told them that Rourke had been convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison, that the other conspirators had also been punished, and that the First Sacramento Bank had implemented new oversight procedures to prevent future fraud. "Your testimony made a difference," she told Eliza, "not just for your case, but for all the victims. People saw that it was possible to stand up to corrupt power and win." Eliza squeezed Thomas's hand and smiled. "It was worth it, all of it. The years that followed were good ones. The ranch prospered under their joint management, Eliza's sharp mind for numbers complementing Thomas's practical skill. They expanded the operation, hiring workers and building new structures, becoming known throughout the region for their fair dealing and quality livestock. Eliza never forgot what had been done to her, but she refused to let it define her future. She used the settlement money from the bank to start a lending program for women trying to start businesses, understanding better than most how difficult it was to rebuild after betrayal and loss. Thomas found peace in the daily rhythms of ranch life and in the partnership he'd built with Eliza. The nightmares from the war faded, replaced by dreams of the future they were creating together. And Ada, watching them build their life with a satisfaction she tried to hide but never quite managed, told anyone who would listen that she'd known all along they were meant for each other. 5 years after that desperate ride to Sacramento, on an evening when the sun painted the hills in shades of amber and rose, Thomas and Eliza sat on the porch watching their ranch spread out before them. In the distance, workers were bringing in the horses for the night. Smoke curled from the bunkhouse chimney. Everything was peaceful, productive, alive.
"Do you ever think about that day?" Eliza asked quietly. "When you found me in the desert?"
Thomas considered the question. Sometimes. Mostly I think about how close we came to never having this. How one different choice, if I'd ridden a different trail that morning, if I'd decided you were too much trouble, everything would have changed. I think about that too, Eliza said. I think about how I'd given up, how I was ready to die. And then you appeared like something out of a dream and gave me a reason to keep fighting. She leaned against his shoulder. The road that was supposed to end my life led me here instead, to you, to home. Thomas wrapped his arm around her, holding her close as the stars began to emerge overhead. I used to think my purpose ended when the war did, that I was just marking time until I died. But helping you, saving you, it gave me a reason to believe my life still mattered, that I could still make a difference. You did make a difference, Eliza said. You saved my life. You helped me find justice. You gave me a future when I thought I had none. And you showed me that sometimes the best thing that can happen to a person is meeting someone stubborn enough to refuse to leave them behind. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into night and the ranch settle into evening quiet. Somewhere in the house, Ada was humming while she prepared dinner. In the barn, the horses nickered softly to each other. The world turned on, indifferent and eternal. But here, on this porch, in this place they'd built together through courage and stubbornness and love, two people who'd been broken found themselves whole again. The desert had tried to claim Eliza's life. Powerful men had tried to erase her existence. Fear and trauma had tried to destroy her spirit, but she'd survived it all. And in surviving, she'd found not just safety but purpose, not just shelter but home, not just rescue but partnership with someone who understood that true strength came from refusing to give up even when the world said you should. Thomas Brennan had found a dying woman on a dusty trail and made the choice to help her. That choice had changed both their lives, had brought them through fire and fear to this moment of perfect peace. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the night breeze carried the scent of sage and earth, they knew with absolute certainty that they'd made the right choice. All of them, every single one.